All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2015 session of the WSGA Rules Review Sessions. I know many of you have been here before and done this, and the intent is to provide just an informal review of the rules and the decisions, whether it's just as a refresher course for the upcoming season or because you're specifically preparing for to attend a PGA USGA workshop, or you just miss seeing your friends from the summer and want a free donut in the morning. Whatever your reason, all valid. Nice to have a full house this morning since it's balmy -1 outside. So that's good. And for those of you online, thank you for joining us. And as David said, in the bottom left corner of your screen, you can submit questions to us by all means. And we're excited to have the online component in part because it's an added convenience for people who can't always come to West Allis, Wisconsin, and also, as we may see invariably during this Wisconsin winter, days that you just don't want to leave home, and you can join us that way. One change for this year, in addition, is that these sessions are being recorded, and the recording will be available on YouTube the following week, so that when David and Bill send out the invitation for next week's session, which will be Friday next week, not Thursday, but it will be Friday from 8 to 12, they'll also send a link to a recording for this. And again, the reason for that is just added convenience. So if while we all think the rules of golf are terribly important, obviously not everyone has half a day out of their schedules to devote to the subject matter each week, so they can save this for a nice quiet, relaxing, or romantic Saturday evening, or for whenever they wish to devote the time. But also with that, we should all be cognizant of the fact that this is being recorded. So among other things, please, one, let me know if I say anything wrong, and also, Arnold, watch with the dirty jokes and so forth. All right, so with that, with this session, again, this is, despite the online component, this is extremely low-tech. So those of you who are expecting fancy PowerPoint slides and videos and so forth, you'll be extremely disappointed that we're just literally going to go through the decisions book in order. We're going to start with the definitions and the first few rules today, and after 6 or 7 sessions, we'll have been through the entire book. And we're not going to go through every part of every rule or every decision. The intent is just to go through things, provide an overview of the definitions of the rules, talk about some of the key points, and then look at some decisions under those rules that are especially helpful or significant. And certainly as we go along, please feel free to ask any questions and so forth. So with that, we'll get started right away with the definitions section. Abnormal ground conditions is really just a catch-all phrase for each condition under Rule 25-1 from which the player is entitled to free relief. All of these conditions are treated the same, so by using these 3 words, we make Rule 25-1 much easier to read. Addressing the ball. This was an important change for the 2012 rules, whereas the definition has been revised to provide that a player's address the ball only when he has grounded the club immediately in front of or behind the ball, regardless of whether he's taking a stance. As most of you know, before 2012, the stance was tied into addressing the ball, but now that has been eliminated. And the thinking behind that is that really what, especially in the context of Rule 18-2B, which exists to say that it's more than just a coincidence that the player's ball is moved after he addresses the ball, but odds are it's the act of addressing the ball, of taking an action so close to the ball that that is what has caused the ball to move, and that it's really grounding the club very near the ball is more important than taking your stance a foot or 18 inches away. So now focusing solely on grounding the club, and also that allows a player in a bunker or in a hazard, bunker or water hazard, to be protected. That one incident that led to this change was in the 2008 British Open, where it was unusually windy even by British Open standards. And a player, Frederick Jakobsen, had his ball in a bunker on a slope. And he was concerned that if he went in and took a stance, or just at any second, including after he took a stance, that the wind would cause the ball to move. And under the previous rules, there was no way for him to protect himself against that movement, because under the old rule, under the old definition, he was considered to have addressed the ball in a hazard just when he had taken a stance. So sure enough, he went in, took a stance, and the ball moved, even though it was absolutely clear that the wind caused the ball to move. So now, under this definition, that a player, assuming he doesn't breach Rule 13-4 about grounding his club in the hazard, has not addressed the ball in the hazard before playing from it. So that makes for a more reasonable result.
Hi, John. Yeah. What if the player, if there are some players that have a habit of never grounding their club, is that, if they do that, does that count as addressing the ball?
Okay, so let's say, for example, a player, well, it could be a player just never does it. So, for example, if he's hitting a 7-iron from the fairway, he might simply never ground a 7-iron. What that means is he has not addressed the ball. So the significance of that is that means he has protected himself from any penalty under Rule 18-2B, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's protected himself from any penalty, and that he could do something else that might cause the ball to move that could result in a penalty under Rule 18-2A. But he has protected himself. And, that's a smart thing to do, for example, if you're playing off pine straw, not to ground the club, even though it's possible that just the movement of your feet on the pine straw might cause the ball to move, in which case there would be a penalty under Rule 18-2A, but not under 18-2B.
Jack Nicklaus.
Yeah.
Never dropped it.
Yeah, and some people won't ground their clubs either, for swing reasons, because they feel like that encourages a smoother takeaway and so forth, or simply because they're paranoid and don't want to incur penalties. All right, advice. This definition seems straightforward, but it's one of the tougher ones to apply and administer. Any counsel or suggestion that could, not that actually does, but that has the potential to influence a player determining this play, the choice of a club, or the method of making a stroke. But information on the rules, distance, or matters of public information, such as, is the hole in the front or the back, is not considered to be advice. And the advice rule, Rule 8-1, is an extremely simple one-sentence rule. However, in practice, it can be very difficult determining whether a player's question or a comment constitutes asking for or giving advice. And that's one reason that you'll see a lot of experienced officials will do everything they can to stay out of earshot of the players, because they simply don't want to hear what players are saying and have to rule on what, for example, when players are waiting on a tee for the fairway or green to clear, they talk a lot. And, who knows what in the world they talk about, and often you just don't want to know, because a lot of times there can be a lot of comments or questions that are in the gray area as to, gee, is that advice or isn't it? And it's difficult. It's one of the more challenging rules to apply, and this is a good example of why the definitions are so important, is that the advice rule itself couldn't be more straightforward, but it's the definition that is the real key to determining whether there is a breach of the advice rule. So it's a counsel or suggestion that could influence a player in determining his play. So, for example, if I'm playing with Tiger Woods and I suggest to Tiger that if I hit a 6-iron and came up short, that he should probably hit a 5-iron. That's really not helpful to him. But, in some ways that could be helpful because he might know that, he's 2 or 3 clubs longer than I am, and if I hit 6 and came up short, then he should hit 7 or 8 or whatever. So, moving on down, ball and play. Another important definition that's related to some other definitions and related to several rules. For example, Rule 18 that will come across several weeks from now talks about what happens when a ball in play is moved. Well, in order for that rule to apply, first the ball has to be in play. And if the ball is not in play, then we don't even look to Rule 18. So there's a big difference, for example, between moving a ball accidentally with a practice swing on the teeing ground before your first stroke, at which point the ball is not yet in play, and doing so, say, with your second shot, before your second shot when the ball is in play, in which case Rule 18-2A would apply. And it relates to other items as well, such as the definition of wrong ball. Wrong ball. So, for example, the player hits his tee shot out of bounds, and if he plays that ball, what's the ruling? Well, first, we look at this. Has he played the ball in play? Well, what does it say? It says it remains in play until it's hold, except when it's lost, out of bounds, lifted, or another ball has been substituted. So that means once that ball goes out of bounds, it's no longer in play. So, therefore, we look at the definition of wrong ball and realize that if you play the ball, even though it's your ball, line out of bounds, you've played a wrong ball. And Rule 15 would apply to that. So for the definition itself, the ball is in play as soon as the player's made a stroke on the teeing ground. It's in play until hold, except if it's lost, out of bounds, or lifted, or another ball has been substituted, in which case the substituted ball becomes the ball in play. And that's an important distinction in that, whether that substitution is permitted is a whole separate issue. But the important point for now is knowing that if you substitute balls, that substitute ball is the ball in play. It's not a wrong ball, which it might be an improperly substituted ball, and there could be a penalty for improperly substituting, but it is not a wrong ball. And we'll see in Rule 15 that there's a significant difference between Rules 15-2 and 15-3. In that regard. If a ball is played from outside the teeing ground with starting play of the hole, and this is not, the ball is not in play in Rule 11-4 applies. Otherwise, ball in play includes the ball played from outside the teeing ground when the player elects or is required to play his next stroke from the teeing ground. So the key here is in the first sentence where it talks about when the player is starting play of the hole or attempting to correct that mistake. So let's say on the third hole I could go up to the tee and I tee up in front of the tee markers and play. That ball is not in play, and if it's stroke play, we'll see on Rule 11 with a 2-stroke penalty, I have to correct that mistake by playing from within the teeing ground or be disqualified. In match play, my opponent has the option to let that stroke stand or to require me to cancel and replay from within the teeing ground. And then we see the exception that if he wants that stroke to stand, let's say because I hooked it into the trees, then that ball is, in those circumstances, deemed to be in play. But with the second sentence of that second paragraph, otherwise ball in play includes the ball played from outside the teeing ground when the player elects or is required to play from the teeing ground. So that, at first, that seems like an odd sentence. So let's give an example to put it in context. Where let's say I hit my tee shot out of bounds. So we know the out-of-bounds rule requires me to return to the tee and play from the tee ground. But instead, I tee up my ball at a different set of tees or just outside that tee ground and play. So in match play, we know it's straightforward. I've played from a wrong place under the out-of-bounds rule, so I lose the hole. In stroke play, what's the ruling? Well, I've played from a wrong place. And I've played from a wrong place under which rule? Under the out-of-bounds rule. It required me to play from within the tee ground. So, and let's say I teed up, foot in front of the markers. So it's not a serious breach of playing from the wrong place, and that ball is in play. So with that example in stroke play, what would be my total penalty? Emphasis on total, and think about that as bring yourself to think about quiz question. Total penalty. 1 penalty stroke for going out of bounds, and then 2 penalty strokes for playing from the wrong place under Rule 27-1, the out of bounds rule. Now, what this sentence provides is that even though I played from outside the team ground, that ball is in play. So it's not a wrong ball, so that means I am required to continue with that ball wherever I hit it, hopefully in the fairway this time. So that is not a wrong ball, that is in play, and I continue with it, but I did play from a wrong place. And as we'll see, and we'll touch on this again under Rule 11, with the key point that Rules 11-4 and -5 apply solely when starting the play of the hole. So once you've played from within the team ground, those rules no longer apply. So,
John?
Yeah.
Match play, the player, my opponent tees up outside the team ground, hooks it out of bounds, so I have the option to cancel the stroke or tee, but he's hit it out of bounds, so I want that stroke to count. Now,
nice guy, Gary.
I'll do anything to win. So, does he now have to, because he teed up outside the team ground, does he have to drop a ball in that spot?
Okay. All right. Very, very good question, Gary. The question is, in match play, if a player, in case everyone didn't hear, if a player plays from outside the team ground, hits it out of bounds, and his opponent does not want him to cancel and replay, then he has to proceed under the out-of-bounds rule, which is stroke and distance, so playing from where he just played from, and where did he actually play from outside the team ground. So how is he going to put that ball into play? In that case, by dropping it, actually. That he can't tee it since he didn't actually play it from within the team ground. Okay, bunker. Bunker is one of 2 types of hazards, with water hazards being the other type. And the bunker consisting of a prepared area of ground, often a hollow from which turf or soil has been removed and replaced with sand or like. So bunkers are really man-made hazards. The grass-covered ground bordering or within a bunker, including a stacked turf face, not that you see it that often in this country, whether grass-covered or earthen, is not part of the bunker. So what does that mean? That means that, for example, there's no penalty for touching that grass-covered face with, say, your backswing. It means if the ball is embedded in that grass-covered face, that it's not in the bunker, and if the local rule for embedded ball anywhere through the green's in effect, you get relief from that. But it goes on to say a wall or lip of the bunker that's not covered with grass is part of the bunker. And sometimes you'll see on courses that keep a nice, clean edge of the bunkers, and you might see several inches of just earth, a lip between the sand and the turf itself above. That sentence means that bare lip is part of the bunker. So that means that, for example, if you hit that if your ball lies in the bunker and you hit that with your backswing, you can hit ground in the bunker before your stroke, and that's a penalty. And it means that if a ball is embedded in that bare earthen lip, that you not get relief without penalty, that your ball's in the bunker. So you either have to play it as it lies, or with a penalty stroke, proceed under the unplayable ball rule. The margin of a bunker extends vertically downwards, but not upwards. So significance of that is if your ball is, say, on grass, just overhanging the lip of a bunker, or is far-fetched as in a tree branch overhanging a bunker, the ball is not in the bunker. And that will be different from the other type of hazards we'll see. With water hazards, we'll see that the margin does extend vertically upward, but bunkers, margin extends only vertically downwards. and it falls in a bunker when it lies in or touches the bunker itself. So that would be, sand in the bunker or a bare lip around it. Burrowing animals. Let's see, under definition of abnormal ground conditions, it includes holes, casts, or runways made by a burrowing animal. So, in other words, you get relief from just certain types of animal damage made by certain types of animals. So you say a burrowing animal is an animal that makes a hole for habitation or shelter, such as a rabbit, one of the more common ones. And a player does get free relief from certain types of damage created by those animals. So a player is not necessarily entitled to free relief made by any other sort of animal. So, for example, if a ball is in a hole made by a dog, a player is not automatically entitled to relief under Rule 25-1 from that. But the committee certainly has the authority, if it wishes, to deem that hole to be ground under repair. And that's certainly within the committee's purview. Caddy is one who assists the player in accordance with the rules, which can, but doesn't necessarily have to, but often involves carrying or handling the player's clubs during play. So we'll see, the caddy adds an interesting aspect to the game that, ordinarily we think of golf as a solitary pursuit where it's one player against one other player against one other player, but the caddy actually adds an element of teamwork to the sport, in that not only can the caddy help the player handle his equipment, he can also give the player advice during the round. And not that you see it that often in competition, but more in just regular play. When you have a shared caddy, the definition goes on to clarify whose caddy that caddy is considered to be in certain situations. That the caddy is considered to be the caddy of the player sharing the caddy whose ball is involved, except when the caddy is acting on specific directions of another player sharing the caddy, in which case he's considered to be that other player's caddy. And this is similar to what we'll see later under the definition of equipment with a shared golf cart and the treatment of that cart. So let's say, for example, if Dan and I are sharing a caddy, and the caddy first walks over to Dan's ball, gives Dan a 6-iron to hit, and then is walking towards me, but I haven't told him to walk towards me, and then Dan hits one of his rare bad shots and strikes the caddy. Question is, and let's say, that to make it really matter, that it's match play. Dan and I are playing a match against each other. So the question as to whose caddy it is very important. If it's Dan's caddy, what's the ruling under Rule 19? If Dan's ball strikes his own caddy, 1-stroke penalty. If Dan's ball strikes my caddy, his opponent's caddy, then what's the ruling? Then Dan has the option to cancel and replay. So very different results. So that's why it's important to know whose caddy it's considered to be at that time. And that set of circumstances, he would still consider to be Dan's caddy. Now, where that would be different would be, say, if I specifically called the caddy over and said, here, come stand here out Dan's way, he's got a case of the shanks today, or something like that, then he's considered to be my caddy at that time. So that's important to know that a caddy is someone who's able to give the player advice, but there's responsibility with that, as we'll see, especially under Rules 18 and 19, for moving the ball at rest or for deflecting the ball. Now, one point to keep in mind with this, because I know a lot of you have graciously help out at high school and college events, including the Marquette tournament at Erin Hills, is that in team events, when a coach is permitted to give advice, that even though the coach is allowed to give advice, he remains an outside agency, which is specifically important with Rules 18 and 19, that even though he can give advice, he doesn't essentially become a caddy of the other prohibitions and ramifications of that. The coach is just a special type of outside agency who's allowed to give the player advice. All right, casual water. Perhaps the most important word in the first line is just temporary. It's a temporary accumulation of water. So it's not just a sheen, but an actual accumulation of water on the course. It's not in a water hazard. It is visible before or after the player takes his stance. So one question, it's not too far-fetched, but it's a valid question, and that it's a useful question that forces us to read the definition closely. What's the ruling if let's say, I hook my tee shot near the out-of-bounds line? The ball is just in bounds. But to play the ball, I'd be standing in a puddle of water that lies out of bounds. What do the rules call that puddle of water lying out of bounds?
Puddle of water lying out of bounds.
That's right. That's right. It's not casual water because, why? It's not on the course. So, as Dan said, the technical term would be a puddle of water lying out of bounds. And since Rule 25 and no other rule provides relief for a puddle of water lying out of bounds, the player is not entitled to relief. So that is an important distinction there. Snow and natural ice are either casual water or loose impediments at the option of the player. I know the WSGA season starts in May, and hopefully by then that won't be an issue. Manufactured ice is an obstruction. So we'll see later that means under Rule 24-1 that there's no penalty if the player moves his ball while removing manufactured ice. Dew and frost are not casual water. And we'll see, and that's important, because we'll see under Rule 13-2 that a player is not allowed to improve, for example, the area of his intended stance or his line of play by removing, dew. Committee is the committee in charge of the competition, or if the matter doesn't arise in the competition, the committee in charge of the course. So more often than not, with just daily play, if some sort of dispute comes up, who's often left to be the final arbiter? Usually the golf professional. And again, which is a very good reason for everybody, and especially golf professionals, to learn the rules well, because they're often put in the difficult position of having to make rulings. And if you have to make a ruling in a match between your golf committee chairman and the club president, you want to make sure you get that ruling correct. A competitor is a player in a stroke play competition. So that's one hint that if ever you're taking a quiz or exam, you see the word competitor, the question involves stroke play. And this definition exists, to some degree, just to allow the term fellow competitor to exist. Fellow competitor is any person with whom the competitor plays. So strictly speaking, say at the state amateur stroke play championship, if players in different groups are not fellow competitors, that only the players in your group are fellow competitors. The players on another hole are simply other competitors. And then in Rules 29 through 31, we'll see where that second paragraph matters, where the context so admits the word competitor includes his partner. And a good rule of thumb, and it's just that, a rule of thumb, it's not complete, is that in general, if a rule prohibits a player from doing something, then that usually means that his partner also is prohibited from doing the same thing. That the player, for example, can't use his partner to circumvent that rule. Course, the whole area within any boundaries established by the committee. So, among other things, that means the committee does not have to define boundaries. That if a committee, whether just because of the expansive nature of the property or because of the daunting task of installing several hundred boundary stakes, wants to say there's simply no out of bounds on this golf course, that's okay. They can do that. But course and out of bounds do not rely on property ownership. It's simply a matter of where, if anywhere, the committee established a boundary line. Equipment is anything used, worn, or carried by the player, or anything carried for the player by his partner or either of their caddies, except a ball he's played, the hole being played, and a small object such as a coin or tee when used to mark the position of a ball or the extent of an area in which the ball is to be dropped. So that last part with the coin and tee, seems an odd addition, but it's a useful one for a couple reasons. Let's say that Dan and I are playing a match again, and Dan has a putt, and his ball goes over the dime that I used to mark the position of my ball. Now, if that dime were considered to be my equipment, what would be the ruling? Then he would have the option to cancel and replay that throw for striking my equipment. But that really doesn't make much sense when his ball is rolled over a dime and it's something that he could have asked me to have moved beforehand. So by saying that dime is not equipment, because it is used to mark the position of my ball at that moment, it's not equipment, so Dan just has to play his ball wherever it comes to rest. Then with the tee, that can be one where it talks about the area in which a ball is to be dropped. Let's say Bill's taking relief from a cart path, and he puts the tee in to measure, to identify his nearest point of relief, and then he puts the tee at the 1 club length area in which he's going to drop the ball. And if he drops the ball within that 1 club length area and strikes one of those two tees, but otherwise still comes to rest in an acceptable spot, then by saying that tee is not equipment, he plays the ball as it lies. Because if that tee were considered to be equipment, what would he have to do? He would have to redrop. So that's why those two exceptions are in there. It goes on to say equipment includes the golf cart, so it could be a trolley you pull or a motorized cart in which you ride. And we'll look at that really with note 2, with what to do is often the case when players share a cart. Whose equipment is it considered to be? Again, similar to what we talked earlier about with a shared caddy. Well, when the cart's shared by 2 or more players, the cart and everything in it are deemed to be the equipment of one of the players sharing the cart. Okay, so now we have to figure out whose cart is considered to be. If the cart is being moved by one of the players sharing it, the cart and everything in it is deemed to be that player's equipment. So with that, the key, where it talks about is being moved by, that's to be taken literally. That means being moved by means the wheels are in motion, the cart is in motion. Otherwise, meaning if the cart is stationary, the cart and everything in it are deemed to be the equipment of the player sharing the cart whose ball is involved. So we'll go through a couple of examples again with Dan and I are sharing a cart. We drive over to my ball. Dan drops me off, and then he is driving to his ball. And while he's driving to his ball, I hit a bad shot. My ball strikes his cart, strikes the cart while it's in motion. Then whose cart is it considered? Whose equipment is it considered to be? It's considered to be Dan's.
Even if it hits your golf.
Yeah. Even if, let's say, it hits my golf bag, it's still considered to be Dan's equipment at that time. So then, what the ruling would depend on as to who Dan is. Is he my partner, fellow competitor, or an opponent? But let's say Dan drops me off at my ball, then drives to his ball, parks. So the cart's stationary. I shank the ball, and it strikes my bag, or let's say it strikes Dan's bag on the cart. then whose equipment have I struck? I've struck mine. Because the cart is considered cart and everything on it, even if it belongs to Dan, is considered to be mine unless it's in motion when the ball actually strikes it. And that's
can we go through your scenario with the caddy? When Dan, you had mentioned, Dan Shanks and hits the caddy, whether or not it's acting on the instruction of the other player. What if Dan and you are sharing a caddy and a cart? They drop you off at your ball, and now that caddy is moving Dan and the cart, and you hit a tree and it ricochets and hits the cart or Dan or the caddy.
Okay, so now you're combined. So now a player. So now Dan and I are sharing a caddy and we're sharing a cart.
I'll share caddy.
I think that would
together the answer would be significantly different, would it not?
Well, let's think about that when you combine the two. So you have a shared caddy and a shared cart.
So the cart's moving, so the cart and everything in it are doing.
Yeah, so let's say everything in it includes any person in the cart.
Right.
So that means that would include the caddy in the cart. So if my ball strikes the caddy in the cart while the cart's in motion, then he's considered to be the caddy. Then he's considered to be the caddy. Well, in that case, unless he's acting on Dan's specific instructions, he's considered to be my caddy.
So is he considered to be the equipment? It would be the equivalent of John.
Well, it would be both. In that case, you have to determine, who's actually first, who's actually responsible for moving the car at that time. So we say that it'd be one thing if you told the caddy, drive over here. Then at that moment, he would be your caddy. So you'd say that it makes sense then for the car to be his also. But if he's, on his own driving over to your ball, then, he'd still be my caddy. So, but let's one of the benefits of the state amateur this year at Erin Hills is you don't have any carts. So we don't need to worry about that come July. All right, flag stick. Flag stick is a movable obstruction, but it's one that has a special status under the rules, and that there are certain times where there's a penalty for striking the flag stick, and there's certain things you may and may not do with the flag stick. The flag stick is a movable straight indicator with or without bunting or other material attached, centered in the hole to show its position. It must be circular in cross-section, and it can't have padding or shock-absorbent material added to it. So that is it. So it is a movable obstruction, but it's one that's special enough that, as we see, it has its own rule under Rule 17. We'll get into the details of that later. Fore caddy is one who is employed by the committee to indicate positions of the ball. He's an outside agency. So, significance of that final line is if you have a fore caddy out there in the landing area, you hit an errant tee shot, hits him, there's no penalty for striking him, and you play the ball as it lies. And fore caddies can be, quite a luxury to have when, in terms of helping with pace of play and so forth at tournaments. And even though the word caddy is embedded in there, that he's still not considered to be a caddy of the player, so the fore caddy would not place a player in breach of the limitation of one caddy at a time.
John, what about casual play when your caddy becomes subordinate?
Okay, all right. So when you leave a green, caddy gives you the driver, or he goes up to the landing area. And you're right. Often, what will the caddy say? He'll say, "I'm going to go fore caddy." Mm-hmm. Well, under the rules of golf, he's still your caddy at the time, even though he's out there, trying to help find balls. But he is still your caddy. So if you strike him, you would be penalized.
Why did they use the term employed as opposed to authorized?
Well, it's an interesting question because employed, you lawyers can tell me, but employee, does that imply some sort of compensation? And could that be why so often you hear the word spotter, because spotters can be volunteers as opposed to employed for that?
Referees, they're not paid either, are they, Bill?
Depends on who's refereeing.
It is an unusual term that I don't think is used anywhere else in the rules or decisions. Employed. Caddy is not the definition of caddy doesn't use the word employed. And I've wondered about that, and just whether historically, whether committees did, maybe tell juniors here, go out and spot balls on the fourth fairway and we'll give you $1 or something. I don't know. It's an interesting word, and I've wondered about that. It emphasizes that the player's not the one employing them, but whether you could just say, it could be a four caddy is one appointed by the committee or something like that. So that is, kind of an unusual word for the rules. Scott. All right, forms of match play. A lot of the examples will go over just involve singles match play, one playing against another. Rule 29 will touch on threesomes and foursomes. A threesome is which one plays against two. Each side plays one ball, which means that one of those two sides, or the side of two players, is playing alternate shots. So you have one player playing his own ball, playing against two players playing alternate shot. Foursome, we are familiar with. It has high visibility in international competitions, whether it's the Ryder Cup, Walker Cup, Solheim Cup, and so forth, where two play against two, and each side plays one ball, so they play alternate shot. And there's some strategy with that the two partners decide who plays from the odd numbered and who plays from the even numbered tees. So, for example, if three of the par threes fall on odd numbered holes, they might want the better iron player to play on those the odd numbered holes. Three ball is a form of match play in which there are three different matches going on. So, say if Dan, Jim, and I have a three-ball match, then I'm playing one match against Dan, one match against Jim, and then Jim and Dan are playing a match against each other. And as we'll see, the key with that, with making rulings, is to separate the matches whenever you can and realize the status of one person with regards to the other match. So, for example, in the match between Dan and me, what status does Jim have? He's an outside agency in that particular match, which can lead to some interesting situations that we'll talk about under Rule 30 in terms of how you could have a case where in match play you could actually wind up with two different scores for the hole. In my match against Dan, I might have a score of 5, where in my match against Jim, I might have a score of 4. Where, say, if I had, if there had been a moved ball and so forth. Best ball is a match in which one player plays against the better ball of 2 or the best ball of 3 other players. Something we don't see much. 4 ball, a very common form of play. In fact, so common that now the WSGA has added a couple national championships for it. A match in which 2 players play their better ball against the better ball of 2 other players. So a very common form of play. Forms of stroke play follow a similar format, except obviously in stroke play you're not going to be able to have threesome, 3-ball, and best ball competition. So in stroke play you're limited to individual, foursome, and 4-ball. And some people, to keep foursome and 4-ball straight in their minds in terms of which, some people like to say that in a foursome match that some of the players are playing some of the time, whereas in a 4-ball match, you actually do have 4 balls being played. One way to keep those two forms of play straight. All right, definition of ground under repair. It's any part of the course so marked by the committee, the most common method being encircling it with white paint, or so declared by its authorized representative. All ground and any grass, bush, tree, or other growing thing within ground under repair are part of the ground under repair. And that is a little bit of a complicated sentence, because we'll see later that at the end of the second paragraph, the margin of ground under repair extends vertically downwards, but not upwards. So let's consider a case where the committee circled a large area and there happens to be a bush rooted within that area. And a player's ball lies outside the ground under repair, stances outside the ground under repair, but he would hit the bush, and to make it even more complicated, say he would hit a part of the bush that overhangs outside the ground under repair. Is he entitled to relief from ground under repair? And the answer is yes, he is, because of that second sentence of the first paragraph. All ground or any bush, tree, or other growing thing within the ground under repair are part of the ground under repair. So even though you don't think of the margins of ground under repair extending vertically upwards, what that means is that that entire bush, no matter where it goes in terms of with regards to the white line, is ground under repair. And it's a pretty fine point and something that comes up very rarely. There's rarely will you circle an area of ground under repair that has a bush or tree or something like that in it, but just something to be aware of. Ground under repair includes material piled for removal and a hole made by a greenkeeper, even if not so marked. So those two items, material piled for removal, could be grass clippings from a greens mower, or a hole made by a greenkeeper. So, for example, if the greenkeeper's dug up a sprinkler head to fix it and your ball goes into that hole, that is automatically ground under repair, even if there's no white paint around it. But grass cuttings and other material left on the course that have been abandoned and are not intended to be removed are not ground under repair unless so marked. Often, clippings from mowers will just be put in the trees and discarded with the intention of just staying there. If that's the case, if you hit your ball there, you aren't entitled to free relief from the area, but those clippings are loose impediments, so if the ball lies through the green, you're allowed to remove those clippings as long as your ball doesn't move. All right, so with this definition, we'll see the similar format with other parts of the course with the other definitions. At first, there's a general description of the area, then we'll talk about the different margins and what exactly is considered to be part of that, and then it goes on to talk about how a ball considered to lie in that area. So we'll see a similar format, for example, with water hazard definition. So when the margin of ground under repair is defined by stakes, the stakes are inside the ground under repair, and the margin is defined by the nearest outside point to ground level. So outside point meaning the top side of the stake away from the ground under repair. So if you need to stretch a piece of string, that's where you would stretch it. When both stakes and lines are used to indicate ground under repair, the stakes identify the ground under repair and the lines define the margin of ground under repair. And we'll see this also under water hazards. So you could have both stakes and lines, with the stakes in there just to let people know from a distance that there is perhaps a large area of ground under repair over there, but the painted line on the ground is what actually defines the ground under repair and what ultimately determines whether a player's ball is in it. When the margin is defined by a line on the ground, the line itself is in the ground under repair. And we said earlier, the margin of ground under repair extends vertically downwards but not upwards. So if you happen to have a ball and a tree branch in the branch of a tree, and the tree is rooted outside the ground under repair, but the branch overhangs part of the tree or overhangs the ground under repair, is that ball in the ground under repair? The answer is it is not, for that reason. Well, for two reasons. One is the tree itself was not rooted within the ground under repair, and secondly, because the margin does not extend vertically upwards. A ball is in ground under repair when it lies in or touches ground under repair. So that means if the ball touches the white line, the ball is in ground under repair. Stakes used to define the margin or to identify ground under repair are obstructions, and probably every case they will be movable obstructions. Now we have a note at the top of the next page. The committee may make a local rule prohibiting play from ground under repair. So, for example, they could do that with an environmentally sensitive area, or the more common application is just with flower beds and other areas that they just don't want players destroying.
John? This definition is tied in part to abnormal ground conditions, and we often get in this debate, I'll use the term debate, when we're playing and do the fully marked ground under repair, where you might have a fair patch, let's say it's right in the middle of a fairway where there's no grass growing, and let's say you have a bare patch in the rough where there's grass, but then there's a bare patch, no holes, no grass. Is it safe to say that the absence of grass doesn't necessarily mean it's abnormal ground conditions, or does it matter whether or not? Because the argument will be, well, if this was a tournament, that would be marked off as abnormal conditions or ground under repair. So when you're trying to settle these disputes within the course, what's a good rule of thumb to?
Well, it's an interesting question, Gary, because the two terms really have different implications. You have ground under repair. That implies that the area is actively under repair. So that's why, for example, you can understand Jack Nicklaus' perspective to say that, Phil Divot Hole should be ground under repair. At first, that's ridiculous. Then you say, well, wait a minute. You put in this mixture of sand and seed, it is under repair. I can understand that. But then you have abnormal ground conditions, which implies that you look at the overall condition of the course, and everything's relative to that. So if you're playing in March, that the overall condition of the course is not going to be great, and so there are going to be a lot of bare areas that you would say, no, that's normal. But in July, you might say, one bare area is abnormal, for certain courses. And it's it's an interesting way for a committee to look at things. And I think often, a good way for a committee to look at things is just in the overall context of the conditioning of the golf course in terms of what's kind of normal for the course as well as what's reasonable. That, rarely will you mark something away from the fairways ground under repair, but it's certainly possible that you could have, for example, a really deep tire rut 10 yards off the fairway, but just because of the severity of it, it's just not reasonable to have someone play from it, and you could consider that ground repair, and that would be fine. So with what you and your friends do, it wouldn't hurt, I suppose, especially if you play a lot together, to just say, in general, this is what we're going to do. Then unless something is really, really bad, nothing off the fairway, and in the fairway it needs to be not just bare, but the surface needs to be disturbed. That, if it's from a smooth, flat, bare surface in the fairway, not asking a lot of the player. But if it has, tire tracks or something like that through it, then that, especially from the fairway, might not be reasonable.
It's always a great idea to check the course before our ground under repair. Gene, I'll never forget, you sent Mike Harrison and I to go mark our first course for the cut ball. And he gave us 2 cases of white paint. And we went out and marked the first and second hole. We ran out of paint.
But Bill makes a very, very, very good point, is that before marking a course, whether it's for ground repair or water hazards or what have you, it is valuable just to at least take a quick walk or spin around the course to see what's there. But sometimes, because once you start marking things, you feel obligated to be consistent.
Right.
And whether it's with ground under repair, or even you could have some wetland areas that are kind of borderline, whether they're water hazards or not, and wanting to be consistent with those throughout the course. That's a very good thing to do. All right. Let's see. The hole must be 4¼ inches in diameter, no more, no less, at least 4 inches deep. If a line's used, the line must be at least an inch beneath the putting green surface. So sometimes you'll see liners used on practice greens and so forth just to help maintain the integrity of the hole, but those may not be used on the course itself. A ball is holed when it's at rest within the circumference of the hole and all of it is below the level of the lip of the hole. So some people make the mistake of when the ball is in the hole resting against the flagstick, but some of the ball is above the level of the lip of the hole to think the ball is holed. It's really not, and then Rule 17-4 we'll see what the player is allowed to do to try to get the ball to fall into the hole. But the key there is the ball is not hold. Honor. The player who is to play first from the team ground is said to have the honor. So, strictly speaking, the honor applies only to the team ground, and which means that if Bill and I are in the fairway, we should not say, John, whose honor is it? That we should just talk about whose turn it is to play. We just have the honor on the team ground. A lateral water hazard, which we'll talk about because this is listed alphabetically before we talk about water hazards, is a type of water hazard or part of a water hazard where it's not possible, or in the committee's eyes, it's not practicable to drop a ball behind the hazard in accordance with Rule 26-1B. That's the option that has the player draw a line from the hole through the point where his ball last crossed the hazard margin and drop behind that. So, for example, on the 10th hole at Pebble Beach, par 4 with the beach all along the right, the player slices his tee shot or second shot onto the beach. If he were to try to apply Rule 26-1B, he probably wouldn't be able to stay on the mainland to do that. And to give that player an option other than stroke and distance, as you'll see under Rule 26, he'll have a couple of other options, with the more common of which is to drop it into clubbing where the ball last crossed the hazard margin. So the reason for that is because it's either impossible or the committee's eyes is not reasonable to have him drop behind the hazard. So, again, similar format to what we saw with ground repair. So now, first that's the description of the area. Now we'll talk about the margins. When the margin is defined by stakes, the stakes are inside the hazard, and the margin is defined by the nearest outside points at ground level. So that's the side of the stake away from the hazard. If both stakes and lines are used, the stakes are there just to identify the hazard, but the line itself is what determines, is what actually defines the hazard margin. So again, hazards, even if you have a painted line, hazard stakes are very, very useful to use to give players a frame of reference. So that one, it lets them know that there is a lateral water hazard over there, and two, if they hit a ball over there, it can give them an idea as to where their ball last crossed the hazard margin. So just because you have a line does not mean you shouldn't also use stakes. When the margin is defined by a line on the ground, the line itself is in the lateral water hazard. And unlike bunkers and ground under repair, the margin of a lateral water hazard extends vertically upwards and downwards. So that means, for example, if your ball is in a tree branch overhanging the lateral water hazard, that ball is inside the lateral water hazard. If your ball is on a bridge that crosses the lateral water hazard, your ball is inside the hazard. And we'll talk later about what that means in terms of whether you're entitled to relief from the bridge and which you're not, and what you're allowed to do if you decide to play the ball from the bridge. Ball is in the hazard when it lies in or any part of it touches the hazard. So if the ball just touches the red line, it means the ball is inside the lateral water hazard. Stakes used to define or identify the margin are obstructions. In hopefully all cases, those stakes will be movable, and as we'll see, that means that a player is allowed to move the hazard stakes even if his ball is inside the lateral water hazard. Note 1 that requires the committee to use the color red to define lateral water hazards. Note 2, the committee may prohibit play from an environmentally sensitive area that's defined as a lateral water hazard. And with those environmentally sensitive areas, there are several decisions under Rule 33-8 that go into details, but in general, a committee should use that local rule for ESAs only when they're basically forced to, because local rule is cumbersome and not easily understood, and it takes away some options from the player. So for everyone's sake, it's better to do everything you can not to use it unless you really are basically forced to use it by law and so forth. Note 3, the committee may define a lateral water hazard as a water hazard. Now, by itself, that seems like a very odd sentence, very odd statement, but we'll put it in context, where let's say that you have an island green, like the 17th at TBC Sawgrass. But let's say around that pond or lake, instead of having the 16th hole to the right and trees beyond all through the green, let's say you had condominiums, and all of that was defined as out of bounds. And let's say a player hits his ball over the green. Could a player proceed under Rule 26-1B? So you draw a line from the hole through that last point of entry, which is on the back fringe, then you go to the other side of the water, and that puts him out of bounds. Well, he can't go out of bounds, so he is physically not able to proceed under Rule 26-1B. So therefore, you say, well, that meets the definition of lateral water hazard, right? And it does. So a committee would certainly be justified in marking that green, painting the hazard line around that green, or especially around the back and sides, as red, since the player is not able to proceed under 26-1B. However, sometimes the committee might say, well, okay, it does meet that definition, but we just don't want the hole to be played that way. We don't want a player coming to the 17th hole with a 3-shot lead, just be able to knock it over the green, drop on the back fringe, and 2-putt for a 4 and get away with it. We want that player to be able to have to keep hitting the ball until it actually hits the green. And if the committee wants that, then this note gives them the authority to mark it yellow, which is what the PGA Tour does, and grant, there aren't the condominiums there and so forth. And often, in cases like that, where you have something that really is a lateral water hazard, but the committee doesn't want to play that way, to give the players an option other than stroke and distance, the committee will also have a dropping zone, which they do up there on the forward tee at 60 or 70 yards. So that's an example of the application of that note. All right, line of play. And this is a term we'll see in a couple of rules, both under Rule 8-2 in terms of who is allowed to indicate the line of play, as well as Rule 13-2, which prohibits the player from improving his line of play by taking certain acts. So line of play is the direction the player wishes his ball to take after a stroke, and because the ball doesn't always go exactly where you want, includes a reasonable distance on either side of the intended direction. It extends vertically upward from the ground, but does not extend beyond the hole. In the line of play, for example, might not even be toward the hole. If you hit your ball into the trees, your line of play might be at 90 degrees back to the fairway. Now, a line of putt is essentially the same, but it's more specific in that line of putt exists only when the ball lies on the putting green. So line of putt is the line the player wishes the ball to take after a stroke from the putting green, and except with respect to Rule 16-1E, which talks about staying astride the line of putt during the stroke, line of putt includes a reasonable distance on either side and does not extend beyond the hole. And this is especially important as we'll see under Rule 16 that a player is prohibited from touching his line of putt, except in a few instances. Not just improving it, but he's prohibited from simply touching the line of putt. And what can make this confusing, just to be aware of, it doesn't happen often, but just be aware that it can happen, is sometimes your line of putt could include part of the course that's not on the putting green. That let's say, for example, you have an L-shaped green with the hole in one corner, your ball in the other corner, but your ball is on the green, and you're actually going to take out your 60-degree wedge and pitch it over the bunker. So what is your line of putt? The line of putt goes right through that bunker. But often, more common example would be sometimes your line of putt might extend up through the fringe and so forth. So just keep in mind the same prohibitions of Rule 16-1A against touching your line of putt would also apply. And in that first case, this actually happened in the U.S. Mid-Amateur several years ago on such a green where, being mindful of the fact that the player is still playing from the putting green, even though he's got his 60-degree wedge in his hands, which means, for example, that it's probably not a good idea to leave the flag stick in the hole unattended, because if he were to pitch and strike the flag stick, he's penalized, because he played from the putting green and struck an unattended flag stick in the hole. All right, loose impediments. We'll see this. These are contrasted with obstructions that we'll see later. Loose impediments are natural objects, and we'll see that obstructions are man-made objects. So loose impediments are natural objects such as stones, leaves, twigs, dung, worms, insects, and likes, and cast and heaps made by them. So one interesting point there is, and a somewhat common question, is what's the status of anthills? Is an anthill considered to be a loose impediment and therefore could be removed? And the answer to that is yes, and that's not necessarily intuitive because it goes on, the definition goes on to say that sand and loose soil are loose impediments on the putting green but not elsewhere. So we have it, so we know that generally we're not supposed to move sand and loose soil, but anthills are different since they are heaps made by insects. They are loose impediments as long as they and your ball are not in the same hazard, you may remove them. So those items are loose impediments as long as they are not fixed or growing. So, for example, a leaf attached to a tree is not a loose impediment, but a leaf that's fallen off the tree and now lies on the ground is a loose impediment. Something that's solidly embedded. So the stone that is now solidly embedded, whether naturally or because someone has stepped on it or run it over so it's solidly embedded in the ground, is not a loose impediment, which means that it cannot be removed if that would improve one of the areas protected by Rule 13-2. Or if the item is adhering to the ball. So early in the morning, if you have a grass clipping that is adhering to the ball because of the morning dew, that grass clipping is not a loose impediment in that instance, and therefore may not be removed. And if you were to remove it, you would be considered to have cleaned the ball, with a one-stroke penalty.
John, is that related to when Sam Snead played in the U.S. Open at the night? I forgot what year it was, but he blew a bug off the ball.
That was, I think that was Lloyd Mangrum at Marion in 1950. It was in the playoff with George Fazio and Hogan on the 16th hole, where, there was a bug on the ball. This was 1950, and I think he just lifted the ball and removed the bug. And obviously very different rules back then. I think that was before players were simply even allowed to lift their ball on the putting green for any reason. So I'm not, and it wound up being a two-stroke penalty, but I forget if it was for I don't think it was for the bug, because the bug, if a live bug wouldn't be considered adhering to the ball. My guess is there was a penalty for lifting his ball from putting green when he wasn't allowed to.
See, I must have remembered wrong.
Maybe Snead did something in Medina also, but that one was named from...
You were pretty young back then.
I was pretty young,
yeah.
Yeah, I was even younger.
I bet you were.
And so sand and soil are loose impediments on the putting green, but not elsewhere. So the key with that distinction is location of the sand and soil and not location of the ball. So, for example, where this comes up the most of it is with sand that's been splashed out of bunkers. So if the player's ball lies on the fringe and there's a lot of sand on the green, he can remove the sand on the green even though his ball's on the fringe, but he may not remove the sand on the fringe. Likewise, if his ball is on the putting green, let's say there's a big mound of sand on the fringe just behind him, he may not remove that sand because that sand is off the putting green, even though his ball is on the putting green.
John, there's a decision that always confuses me where an acorn is embedded into the green. I mean, it's down. And the question is, can you remove that? I mean, it is embedded, and that would consequently provided that it is not embedded, that you could not remove it. But the decision allows you to remove it, but not repair the hole. Opposite.
Yeah. So the first question dealing with, say, an acorn embedded in the putting green, let's say the greens mower ran over it, is that the question is whether that acorn is solidly embedded. And that, frankly, can't be a tough question to answer. And you talk with good rules officials, say, what's your definition of solidly embedded? And you get different guidelines. Some will say, well, if you can just immediately flick it out of there with a tee in one motion, I'd say that's not solidly embedded. But if you have to kind of dig around it, get it out, then that's solidly embedded. But, as you said, let's say even if it's not solidly embedded and you remove the acorn, then you're not allowed to repair the depression it's in because it's not a ball mark or an old hole plug, assuming this is on your line of putt. So especially if it's solidly embedded, you might be better off just even putting with it. Granted, even if it's solidly embedded, you can't remove it anyway, but there's really nothing to be gained.
Okay. One of the things that I've seen through the years is the issue of worms coming out of the ground and the cast. The difference between that soil being a cast of a worm and a loose soil, whether it be around the fringe or in a fairway.
Yeah, and that can be tough as, after rains and so forth, and depending on the time of year when you see the worms coming up and you see the little kind of like cones they leave, that, according to this, that is a loose impediment even. And at first it strikes you as a little odd because you're used to saying not touching sand or loose soil other than on the putting green, but that specifically allows for it. So it could be worms and anthills are probably the most common. So that is a possibility, and not that many people I think are aware of that.
Can you take the loose impediment, the worm cast, tap it down with your club?
Well, what the rule allows you to do is remove it. And
put your fingers on it and remove it that way?
Well, yeah, and you're allowed to remove it, and then the question is, after, let's say there's still some there, what's left can become a difficult question as to at what point is the loose impediment gone, and at what point are you now actually tapping down something you shouldn't be tapping down.
But it's gooey. I don't want to.
Get over it, Paul. And you can do it.
But that can be an issue, and that's why, really, and the very reason you mentioned is one reason back around, I think it was around 2000 or so, that the restrictions on removing loose impediments from the line of putt with only, your hand or club was removed because, you'd have goose dung and so forth. I don't want to use my hand or club to remove this. Why can't I, use a towel or something else? And they have a valid point. As long as you don't do anything else you shouldn't do by pressing anything else down, should we really care how that loose impediment's removed from your line of putt? All right. Let's see, just as we saw earlier with casual water, a reminder that dew and frost are not loose impediments. So which means, among other things, that there could be certain Rule 13-2 ramifications if they are removed. All right, definition of lost ball, which is a big definition and an important one, is there are several rules and concepts that it touches on. First point is that this definition has been organized in such a way that it starts off with the most common way that a ball becomes lost and finishes with the least common way a ball becomes lost. So it has been organized that way to help us. So the most common way a ball becomes lost if it's not found or identified as his by the player within 5 minutes of search for it. And note also, the definition starts off by saying deemed, because you can have some situations where it doesn't seem intuitive for a ball to be lost. Common one, that I'm sure you've all heard of is, say, Dan and I tee off, our balls come to rest right next to each other in the middle of the fairway, but we realize we're playing identical balls and we can't tell whose is whose. Well, if we can't identify which is ours, both of our balls are lost. We have to return to the tee. So that's the case where even though we found the balls, but we just don't know which is which, it's lost. Likewise, if you search for 5 minutes, don't find your ball, and then at 5:05 you do find it, well, it's still lost under the rules. B, ball's lost if the player's made a stroke at a provisional from the place where the original ball is likely to be, or from a point near the hole in that place. So the reference point is where the original is likely to be and not where the original actually is, because in many cases we never wind up knowing where the original actually is. So let's say I have hit my tee shot into an area that is approximately 150 yards from the hole, and then I hit a provisional ball up there 100 yards from the hole. And I walk up and I play my provisional ball again, and then I find my original ball lying 75 yards from the hole. And it turned out it hit a cart path and rolled for 75 yards. At that point, what's the status of my original ball?
No longer. Your original?
Yeah, my original ball. So I hit my original, I think I'm 150 from the hole. I hit my provisional ball. I hit a longer shot of my provisional. It's 100 yards from the hole. Yeah. As soon as I hit that second shot with the provisional from 100 yards, then the original is lost, even if I wind up finding it, and even if I wind up finding it closer to the hole. C, a ball is lost if the players put another ball into play under penalty of stroke and distance, under those three rules. So for water hazard, ball lost or out of bounds, or simply because the player wants to proceed under stroke and distance, or under the unplayable ball rule. And later we'll see an example that this does matter, that this is a case where intent does matter for the intention to proceed under stroke and distance, where, let's say, Bill and I are playing stroke play competition, and our balls are in the fairway. It's Bill's turn to play, but he's, I think, taking too long, so impatiently I go ahead and play first. Then Bill says, John, what are you doing? You played out of turn. He says, you have to cancel and replay in the correct order, which is absolutely wrong, because what should I do in stroke play if I play out of turn? Keep playing, maybe apologize, maybe not, depending on the circumstances, but I keep playing. So then, let's say Bill plays, and then I drop another ball where I just played from, thinking I have to cancel and replay in the correct order. But then Jim said, John, what are you doing? I said, Jim, I'm sorry. I was kind of a jerk and played out of turns, and I'm going to cancel and replay in the correct order. Jim says, no, this is stroke play. You should just continue with the original ball. So at that moment, what should the ruling be?
20 against 6.
Well, 20 against 6. Because what was my intention when I dropped that ball the spot I just played from?
Put the ball in play. Right.
Well, my intention was to cancel and replay the stroke under a rule that doesn't exist. Was my intention to proceed under penalty of stroke and distance? The answer is no. I did not intend to proceed under distance. So therefore, Clause C here does not apply, as I was not intending to proceed under stroke and distance. So as Dan said, I dropped the ball under a non-existent rule. So if I haven't yet played it, so Rule 20-6, the so-called erasure rule, applies. And what would I do? I would lift the drop ball and continue with the original ball. Now, what would the ruling be if I hadn't been playing with Jim and I went ahead and played that drop ball? Then that second ball is in play under stroke and distance, because under Rule 27-1, we say that if you actually play a ball from where the previous stroke was made, deemed to have proceeded under stroke and distance. So that's an example where there's a very, very big difference between dropping but not yet playing and actually playing that ball. All right, D. Ball is lost if the player has put another ball into play because it is known or virtually certain the ball which hasn't been found has been moved by an agency, is in an obstruction, in an abnormal ground condition, or in a water hazard. Okay, so let's go through an example of that. Let's say I hit my tee shot towards the lateral water hazard, and we have virtual certainty that the ball is in the hazard. So let's just accept that as a fact. So I go up and I drop a ball within 2 club lengths of where the ball last crossed the hazard margin. But before I play it, we find my original ball. And let's say we actually find it outside the hazard. At that moment, what's the status of my original ball? The original ball is lost and I can't play it. Because why? Is at the moment I put that other ball into play under Rule 26, I had virtual certainty that the original ball was in the water hazard. So the rules allowed me to do what I did. So I have done nothing wrong, so therefore I'll continue with the drop ball. The only slight, what can change that slightly is whether the discovery of that original ball might make me realize it actually dropped in the wrong place. Let's say I find the original ball is found inside the hazard. Say, oh gee, well if that's the case, the ball couldn't have crossed back here, it must have crossed up here. Then I would correct the mistake as to where I dropped it, but I would still continue under Rule 26. Because I still, at the moment I first dropped the ball, I had virtual certainty the ball was in the hazard, so I was allowed to use the water hazard rule. All right. Then lastly, the ball is deemed lost if the player has made a stroke at a substituted ball. Something, again, that doesn't happen that often, but just to take one somewhat far-fetched situation where, let's say I find my ball on the cart path, and for some reason I leave it on the path and decide to drop and play another ball to the side. As we'll see later, the Rule 24 does not allow me to substitute balls in that case, so I am going to be penalized for improperly substituting balls. But as soon as I play that substitute ball, that original ball will become lost, which means, among other things, that I can't go back and play it after that.
It happens when you're at the Boise Grove State Tournament, especially hole number 4 that I would drop.
So you signed to 4 every single year?
I have before.
You feel like I know the answer to this question.
Well, I don't know the answer to it. We know that you're allowed to declare a ball unplayable, but you're not allowed to declare a ball lost. So every year in this tournament, and it happened to Nicholson at the playoff, somebody hits the ball in the weeds, they hit a provisional, and they come up there and, don't let parents or people go in and start searching for a ball because once they find a ball, it's really good. So, of course, players think they can declare it lost. They can't do that, but what's the rationale for not allowing the player to just declare it lost and proceed on, as opposed to when somebody finds the ball? Now they're stuck.
So you're saying especially when he's played a provisional?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, let's go through the Mickelson case at San Diego back 2000 or so. It was very interesting. On the playoff hole, in the 17th hole, it was Mickelson and Frank Licklider, and they both hit their tee shots to the left down this ravine. And at the time, it was through the green. It was not marked as a lateral water hazard as it is now, but it was just through the green. So they both hit their balls down there, and they both played provisional balls. And Mickelson hit a great tee shot with his provisional ball. So he hit it, 300 yards down the middle. And he gets down there and he says, just to himself, he's saying, geez, even if I find it down there, I'm not going to do any better than I am line 3 out here. So he tells the marshal, hey, don't look for my ball. But marshals, are enthusiastic and, they think, great, we finally got some action today, and marshals think, geez, one of my responsibilities is to find balls. So they continue to look, and they find this ball down there. And because of where it is and the nature of the area, to go unplayable, his only reasonable option is to get back to the tee. Which means, and the same happened with Licklider. They found his ball too, so both of them had to go back to the tee and play another ball. And part of the reason, there are a few reasons, for all that. One, first question is, well, why can't you just play their provisional balls? And part of the reason for that is you don't want players, especially in stroke play, to have options as much as possible. That you don't want the quality of the shot with the provisional ball to factor into their strategy. Gee, I hit a lousy provisional ball, so I'm really going to try hard to play the original, or I hit a great provisional, so yeah, the heck with that. That you don't want them, to be able to say, gee, do I want to play this over here, or do I want to drop here, and so forth. You want them to know what they have to do.
Question is, and it says, would E come into play if a player proceeded under E without virtual certainty? And I'm assuming you need the long ball.
Okay, so the question is, so let's say, and please correct me if this is not the question. Player hits his ball toward a water hazard. He does not have virtual certainty that the original ball is in the hazard, but he nevertheless goes up and drops the ball under Rule 26 without virtual certainty. And then in order for E to apply, then he would have to play the ball. Yeah, so if he were to do that, then yes, then that original ball would be lost. So in that case, then he's played from the wrong place. Fair chance of the stroke play a serious breach of playing from the wrong place as well.
And have to try to make decision.
Yeah.
After Rule 20.
Yeah. I'm sorry, what's that, Ken?
I guarantee you that question should be on the exam.
Yeah. Well, and we'll get to it. There are a number of decisions right around 26-1/3, a series of 3 or 4, that are very, very helpful to walk through the possibilities. When you drop without virtual certainty, with virtual certainty, when you play it, when you don't play it. And those are a useful group of decisions. So with Gary, back to your question, I don't know if that necessarily answers it, but to some degree, what's interesting is, believe it or not, under the rules years and years ago, you could declare your ball lost. So people who say that actually have some historical basis for saying that used to be the case.
Not if they're 15 years old.
But I think part of it is that playing a provisional ball is a little bit of a luxury, and if you go down that road, then you have to accept what you get with it, and you can discourage people or instruct people not to look for it. But just as if you and I are playing a match, and you hit a great provisional ball, I could be a jerk and go try to find yours.
And then back to Mickelson's lost ball in San Diego. He assumed, or he informed that, hey, don't bother looking for it. I got a provisional like that. And some exuberant sort of goes on and finds a ball. How does that person know when he's searching, he found the ball? They're obligated then to go back and find that ball?
Yeah, if a marshal says there he's got a ball, then Phil is on the hook.
Unless he can't hear.
Unless he can. Well, and one thing that's interesting with the Mickelson case is, let's say his original tee shot he hit into an area, let's say before he, they even started searching for it, he estimated to be 150 yards out. They just killed his provisional, and that's 100 yards out. Could he have just rushed out there and gone ahead and played his provisional ball? He could, and I don't know where Licklider's provisional ball went, so he could have been possibly playing out of turn, but in stroke play, generally no penalty for playing out of turn. The other interesting point with that situation involved the order of play, and I forget the specifics, but let's say when they first, that Mickelson had the honor. Mickelson hit his ball down there, then Licklider hit his ball. They both find the balls. They both decide that their best option under the unplayable ball rule is stroke and distance. So they both come back to the tee. So then, how do they determine the order of play when they return to the tee?
Other balls at the time they were declared.
Exactly. Then you go by the relative positions of their balls unplayable down the canyon. So the order of play when they was actually different. That let's say Licklider's ball was farther from the hole down the canyon unplayable, so he actually played first when they returned to the tee, which confused a lot of people. Because ordinarily you think, well, say if Bill and I are playing, we both hit our tee shots out of bounds, that we keep the same order of play for when we hit our second tee shots. But this is different than out of bounds case.
Decision.
Well, they were proceeding under stroke and distance, but not under Rule 27-1.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we'll cover this under
if they would invert that play order, there wouldn't necessarily be a penalty.
Correct. Yeah, in match play, if they did that, it would be different. And that can be very important in match play. Obviously, and then we'll get into the details of that in Rule 10. And last part of the definition is time spent playing a wrong ball does not count in the 5-minute period allowed for search. All right, definition of marker. And then this is what's interesting. They use a different word than tour caddy. That a marker is one who is appointed by the committee to record a competitor's. Like he may be a fellow competitor, he's not a referee. So the most common and convenient and efficient form of having a marker as a fellow competitor be the marker. But sometimes, say especially in tournaments that have a cut, where after which players play in groups of two, if you have an odd number of players make the cut, then you need a marker to accompany the first player out. And that could be just a volunteer walking along keeping score. As is often the case, sometimes the committee will give the player an option to have a plain marker or a non-plain marker. Some players would prefer to have a plain marker, in part, one, to help them pace themselves, to help with the pace of play and the rhythm, but also so you can see another golf ball, so you can see how the wind affects this person's ball, how the greens hold for this player's ball, and so forth, just as they would in other groups. So a marker is someone just for stroke play. Move removed, an important definition because Rule 18 revolves entirely around a ball that has been moved. And so we have a specific definition saying a ball is moved if it leaves its position and comes to rest somewhere else. So if a player kicks a ball and it rolls 2 inches and then returns exactly to the original spot, according to the rules of golf, that ball did not move. So that's important, and that's one of the reasons why we say that if a ball merely oscillates but doesn't actually come to rest somewhere else, it's not considered to have moved. And that's an important distinction. Nearest point of relief, we'll talk about in Rules 24 and 25. And here's the definitions. The reference point for taking relief without penalty from an immovable obstruction, an abnormal ground condition, or a wrong putting green. And it's the point on the course nearest to where the ball lies. One, it's not near the hole, and two, where if the ball was positioned there, no interference would exist for the stroke the player would have made from the original position if the condition were not there. Then let's go through the note, and then we'll decipher what all that means. In order to determine the nearest point of relief accurately, the player should use the club which would have made his next stroke if the condition weren't there to simulate the address position, direction of play, and swing for such a stroke. All right. Point is, and let's say, let's just use the example of taking relief on a paved cart path, that a player is not required to go through the motion determining his nearest point of relief. What will ultimately determine whether the player has perceived correctly is where he drops and plays from. And as long as he drops and plays from a spot that the rules allow, how he gets there, the rules won't concern themselves. So, for example, if a right-handed player's ball is on the left-hand edge of a cart path, it's running parallel to the hole, he can just eyeball that his nearest point of relief is just a few inches left of the cart path, eyeball where the one club length would put him, and drop within that area. If he does that, he gets everything right, that's fine. There's no penalty for not having gone through the mechanics of determining the nearest point of relief. But it's helpful to determine the nearest point of relief because that will help ensure that you proceed correctly and that you ultimately play from the right place. So nearest point of relief, first and foremost. First is the one single point that's nearest to where the ball lies, that if the ball were there, the player wouldn't have interference from, in our example, the cart path for the intended stroke. So let's say the player, in our case, the cart path is right along the fairway, 150 yards out. So the player would say, okay, if this cart path were here, I'd hit an 8-iron. So he'd take his 8-iron out, simulate the address position for the direction of play and type of stroke he'd make, and let's say he'd make his regular right-hand stroke towards the putting green, and where that 8-iron would be at the address position would be the nearest point of relief. And that can get complicated because you can have certain situations where, let's say, the direction of play might not be towards the green, or maybe because of a tree or a boundary fence or something like that. A left-hand stroke might be feasible. That if for example, if the ball up that edge of the path, but there was also a boundary fence held up against one side of the path, then the player would say, well, okay, if this cart path was here, how would I play the ball? Well, you might say you have to play left-handed. In order to from the cart path, you take relief as if you would for the left-handed stroke. If he takes relief, he can then look into playing it right-handed. But how he determines that nearest point of relief is based on how he would make the stroke if that cart path weren't there. That could mean a side move, shot, left-handed shot, or something like that.
This is I think he has to make a left-handed stroke. Is it players or players in the group, or competitors?
Well, there's sometimes going to be a two-step process. The first, under Rule 24, there's an exception saying you don't get relief if you have interference only by using an unnecessarily or an unreasonably abnormal stance or swing. Of interference. So, first you have to determine if the player is entitled to relief, and if he is entitled to relief, then you look into that. But in most cases, in some cases, it could well be judgment of the referee, whether the type of stroke the player is suggesting in the referee's eyes.
Available. Player and fellow competitor.
Okay, well, and type of thing that ultimately, may well have to be the decision of the referee, because the fellow competitor might say, Gene, I don't think you get relief there. And then when you finish your round, you report to the committee, it comes back out and says, well, so what exactly is the situation? And then they have to walk through things. But again, I know the bottom line is to say, okay, if this cart path weren't here, what type of shot would you make? And that includes right hand, left hand, the direction of play, as well as the club you would use.
That has to do with at Central World, where the cart path in a tree right next to a ball is laying in a not unplayable, a normal playing right-handed player. So he decided that, well, I'm going to play left-handed. Now he's standing on the cart path. Okay. With his heel like that. Well, I'm entitled to read. And his fellow player says, I don't think so. You would play that right-handed, you somehow like that. And he said, no, I can't. So now there was a debate between the two, and as an official was not available right at that time. And he went ahead and played it, and buried the hole. Playing it. But then he questioned me after that, and I said, well, I wasn't there. Let's go back out and take a look. And then he put the ball down where it was, and I said, for me, I would have played it left-handed. Now, this is my opinion of it, so I said, good, and in
cases like that, and that's really kind of more involving the exception to Rule 24-2 than the definition of nearest point of relief. This definition of nearest point of relief really comes up only once you determine the player is entitled to relief. But, with that exception to Rule 24-2, a good way to look at it is just to say, okay, if this cart path weren't here, how would he play the shot? Would he hit it left-handed? And, there's some officials, and I don't think it's a bad way to do it, to go up to the player and say, look, could you look at every player in the eye in the field and say, yes, if this cart path weren't here, I would hit it left-handed. And
that's pretty much
go by that.
Exactly what I did. And he said, the left-handed side, I believe you. Okay.
And sometimes it can be difficult to tell players, especially very good players, what types of shots they can't play. In fact, one tour official told me a pretty interesting story that years and years ago in the early 80s when Bobby Clampett was playing, that he had somewhat of a similar situation, but I think the question came up as to whether Clampett could play a shot from his knees under a tree, and when he did, like his feet would be on the path or something like that. And the player wound up getting relief. But after the round, Clampett called the official over to the range, and he said, well, look, I appreciate the rule and everything, but I just want to show you something for future reference. And he proceeded to hit shots from all sorts of different stances and so forth. He says, I just want you to know that I can hit a ball 150 yards from my knees. That's a reasonable shot for me. I thought that was pretty clever. Okay, observer. And here we again have the word appointed. One who's appointed by the committee to assist a referee to decide questions of fact and to report to him a rule. So having an observer can be a real luxury. And usually when there's an observer, the observer will basically stay one shot ahead of the player. So if the players are on the tee, the observer will be in the landing area. One, to help spot balls, but help to determine questions of fact, such as if the ball did go into this lateral water hazard, where did it last cross the margin? If the ball goes into the spectators, did a spectator move the ball, and so forth. So an observer can be quite useful to have. And again, his main job is helping to determine questions of fact. For example, I remember once, it was funny, back in the U.S. Mid-Amateur back in 1996, I remember I was the observer in a semifinal match, and the referee told me, he says, John, after players hit up to the green, if it looks like the ball might be similar distance from the hole, I'd appreciate if while we're walking up to the green, if you would pace off the distances and radio back to me who's away. I thought, gee, that makes a lot of sense. That saves time, so then when players get up there, they know whose turn it is. So I would do that. I'd radio back and say, Frank, so-and-so's away. And, of course, what I thought was great about this is that Frank would pretend like he never got this information from me. So the players would get up to the green and would turn to him and say, whose turn is it? And he would pretend like he's looking at it for the first time, just point to someone very decisively. And the players just thought he had great eyes. Yeah. Apparently Frank from Fresno. And I thought that was terrific. An observer should not attend the flagstick, stand at or mark the position of the hole, or lift the ball or mark its position. So obviously use a should, not must, because you can't penalize the observer if he does this. And the reason for this admonition is that these are all situations where the observer could cause the player to incur a penalty. And as a rules official, you don't want to put yourself in a position where you could cause the player to incur a penalty. And imagine how bad it would be, say, if you're the observer, if I were the observer in Dan's group, and Dan asked me to attend the flagstick, and then while he putts, I'm busy watching play on another hole, and I don't move the flagstick. Dan's ball strikes the flagstick, he loses the hole. That's not something as a rules official you want to do. Obstructions. This is, we talked about loose impediments being natural objects, while obstructions are artificial objects, including surfaces and sides of roads and paths and manufactured ice, except objects that define out of bounds, even if they're artificial, such as walls, fences, and railings, are not obstructions. Any part of an immovable artificial object that's located out of bounds, and anything declared by local rules to be an integral part of the course is not obstruction. So what the significance of that is, these three cases, by being an obstruction, the player is not entitled to free relief from any of those items. So it could be a boundary stake, a boundary wall, a boundary fence, or it could be something that doesn't define out of bounds, but is simply located out of bounds, such as a barn that's 2 feet beyond the boundary line or something like that. Or, famously, say you have the road behind the 17th green at the old course of St. Andrews, which we'll see this summer at the British Open, that is something artificial. By local rule, the committee has declared that to be an integral part of the course, meaning no relief. So if your ball's on the road, you either play the ball as it lies or deem it unplayable. An obstruction is a movable obstruction if it can be moved without unreasonable effort, without unduly delaying play, and without causing damage. Otherwise, it's an immovable obstruction, and that distinction is important because the relief procedures are very different for movable and immovable obstructions, as we'll see under 24. But generally, with movable obstructions, you just leave the ball where it is and move the obstruction. With an immovable obstruction, because you can't move that obstruction, you move the ball away from it. Note the committee may make a local rule declaring a movable obstruction to be an immovable obstruction. So if a committee wanted to do that for some reason, it may. Generally not advisable to declare something to be something that it naturally is not. If you tell a player, no, that hazard stake is deemed to be immovable, and he says, what are you talking about? Look, I can lift it with 2 fingers. Instead of doing, he improves his line of play, and he's penalized for that. So he really hasn't accomplished much. An opponent is a member of a side against whom the player's side is competing in match play. So opponent is unique to match play. Out of bounds ties into what we talked earlier with the definition of course. It's beyond the boundaries of the course, if the committee established any boundaries, or any part of it was so marked by the committee. So, for example, a committee might mark the practice area to be out of bounds, the clubhouse area, the parking lot, The committee might even have a local rule saying that during play of hole number 7, the 6th hole is out of bounds and have stakes between those holes, or something like that. When out of bounds is defined by reference to stakes or fence, the out of bounds line is determined by the nearest inside point to ground level, stakes, or fence post. So far, the other times we've looked at stakes with water hazards and ground under repair, we talked about outside edge of those stakes, determining the margin. But now, with out of bounds, we're going to look at the inside edge, meaning toward the golf course, to determine out of bounds. And one point to keep in mind, especially for those of you who mark courses, is that fence posts are already taken care of here. That if you have a nice, say, chain link fence or wooden fence, but you have fence posts, that you don't need to add white boundary stakes. In fact, it's much better just to use those fence posts, because those fence posts aren't going anywhere, and sometimes boundary stakes can get knocked down or removed. So no need to add white stakes if you already have a nice fence. Now, in the rare times that both stakes and lines are used for out of bounds, the stakes identify out of bounds and the lines define out of bounds. And this is interesting. There's some people that absolutely hate the idea of using one line to define out of bounds, but occasionally I think that can be useful for tournaments, because one of the benefits of a line is their line's not going anywhere. Whereas a stake can be moved, but the line will be there, and it's nice and simple and straightforward. So sometimes, especially maybe around clubhouse areas where, because of many different angles, cuts in, cuts out, you'd have to have 20 stakes in a 20-yard area. You might just put a few stakes and just paint the line for out of bounds. But the one thing, if you do use a white line for out of bounds, to be very, very clear and careful to make sure nobody mistake that for ground under repair. And that, for example, if you want the clubhouse area to be out of bounds and you have this white line running around the flower bed in front of the clubhouse, some people might think, well, flower bed must be ground under repair, from which relief is mandatory. So sometimes you might even, with the out of bounds line, even paint OB on the far side of it, every now and then for that reason. When out of bounds is defined by a line on the ground, the line itself is out of bounds. The out of bounds must vertically upwards and downwards. So, ball's in a tree branch, overhanging out of bounds, the ball is out of bounds. Now, this is important. A ball is out of bounds when all of it lies out of bounds. So, when you combine that with the fact that the line itself is out of bounds, what part of the line really, let's say the line is half-inch thick, what part of the line really, if you want to split hairs, defines out of bounds? The inside edge toward the golf course. So if you have a painted line on the ground for ball to out of bounds, all of the ball has to be beyond that inside edge of the painted line. Or if you stretch a piece of string between two stakes, all of the ball has to be beyond that string. So what if you have the ball lying out of bounds, but part of the ball over the golf course? It's in bounds. The player may stand out of bounds to play a ball lying within bounds. Objects that define out of bounds are not obstructions and are deemed to be fixed. And that's important, especially with boundary stakes. That if a player hits his ball over near a white boundary stake, that even though it might be readily movable, it's deemed to be fixed. Meaning that if he moves it, in so doing, he improves one of the areas protected by Rule 13-2, such as his line of play or his area of intended stance or swing, he would be in breach of that rule. Let's see, note 1, stakes and lines to define out of bounds should be white. It's not a requirement, as it was required that stakes and lines for lateral water hazards be red. This isn't a requirement because sometimes, for example, around residential areas, homeowners might prefer to have a natural colored stake in their front yard than a bright white stake. Secondly, two, a committee may make a local rule declaring stakes identifying but not defining out of bounds the obstruction. So if a committee has a line on the ground that really defines out of bounds and supplements it with stakes just to let players know that there is a boundary over there, if the committee wishes, the committee could allow the stakes by local rule to be movable. But the key there is in that case, those stakes do not define out of bounds. Yeah, Tim.
Not important, but I'm just curious. Why isn't there a note to obstruction?
A note 2 for obstructions?
Well, a very note out of bounds. Why would there be a note 2 after obstructions, which would define the same thing? You get the impression that you're obstruction. You can't have time that identifies hazard.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying, Ken. So if you're reading just the definition of obstructions, you think, gee, I don't have that authority to do that. Okay. No, that's a good point. I think thinking when that note 2 is a fairly recent addition, maybe 2008 or so, is that since the definition of out of bounds, or that final paragraph talking about objects that define out of bounds being fixed and so on and so forth, is really an exception to that specific paragraph. And in part of it, you could argue with the definition of obstructions is that, Clause A there talks only about objects that define out of bounds. The definition of obstructions is silent on the treatment of objects that identify out of bounds. So you could argue that the definition of obstructions really doesn't say anything either way on it.
Should the state identifying out of bounds be on the line?
And that's an interesting question, because the same issue comes up with water hazards. Should you put water hazard stakes on the hazard line? There are two different schools of thought, because in mind that the whole stake of a water hazard stake is a hole made by a greenkeeper and is therefore automatically ground under repair. But you don't get relief from ground under repair if it falls in a water hazard. So if you have the hazard stake on the line, stake is removed, the ball somehow winds up in that hole, the player doesn't get relief. But so there's some, for example, for many years, I don't know if they still do, the PGA Tour put the stakes off the line, so that through the green. So if you wind up in the hole of the stake, you do get relief. My way of thinking, especially at power level, I think that might just create more confusion. Because I think, if amateur golfers see stakes and lines in different places, they're thinking, what's that about? So I like to put the stakes on the lines, and I remember once at a seminar, that'll never happen with the ball coming to rest in the hole. And they said, when it actually happened to NCAA Division I final last year in Auburn, and cost them the championship or something like that. But I think it's just, it looks better and it's less confusing to have the stakes on the lines.
I have a question. Under ground under care, sky, on what color do you use? Under a lateral hazard, it recommends right in the definition. Out of bounds, it recommends white. Under water hazard, it recommends yellow. Why are they silent on the ground under repair?
One thing that's interesting with ground under repair is in certain parts of the world, they actually use blue paint under repair. In part, because in the same parts of the world, they often will paint out of bounds. So part of the thinking was that if it's that common to practice, differentiate. Do that. That's a good question.
Yeah. We're at 2 hours. Okay. Did you want to keep running or
what? Why don't we let's finish the definitions, and then we'll just take a 10-minute break, because I think the remaining ones are relatively straightforward. All right, outside agency, divide between match play and stroke play. Match play is any agency other than the players or opponent's side, a caddy of either side, a ball played by either side, or equipment of either side. In stroke play, it's going to be even broader because your fellow competitor in stroke play is an outside agency. So any agency other than your side, your caddy, or ball being played or equipment. It's pretty self-explanatory. It includes referee, marker, observer, and floor caddy. Wind and water are not outside agencies. So the significance of that, at Rule 18, is if you have a situation where a ball at rest has been moved, even if you know with absolute certainty that wind moved it, Rule 18-1 does not apply. And in fact, none of Rule 18 will apply, which means by default, you pay the ball obligation. And one point to keep in mind, to train yourself with this, and we've talked about before, is with the definition, be open to the idea that some people or objects fall under more than one definition. That in other words, if you fall under one definition, you can't fall under another definition. So, for example, with outside agency, this focuses on, to a large degree, on people, but it could also be objects. So it could be a pine cone that falls off a tree. It could be a stone. It could be the tree itself. It could be a paved cart path. Those are outside agencies and have certain ramifications of that. So, for example, under Rule 18-1, when we get into a ball from the putting green that's deflected by a moving outside agency, that could mean a leaf that's falling across the green. So that leaf, while ordinarily we think of leaves first and foremost as loose impediments, is also an outside agency. So just be open to that concept. A partner is a player associated with another player on the same side. So that's just in threesome, foursome, ball and four-ball play. So in other words, in say high school and college golf, teammates and individual stroke play are not partners; they're just teammates. And part of the significance of that is that as teammates, they may not exchange advice, whereas partners in say a four-ball competition may exchange advice. Penalty stroke is one added to the score of the player under certain rules, whether it's a procedural rule, such as for taking relief from a water hazard, or because the player did something wrong, like he moved his play. And threesome and foursome play, where you're playing alternate shot, penalty stroke does not affect the order of play. So if Bill and I are partners in foursome play, and I hit our second shot out of bounds, Bill will still play the next shot, even though that would be our fourth shot for the hole. A provisional ball is a ball played under Rule 27-2 for a ball that might be outside a water hazard or out of bounds. We'll go into that in more detail. Putting green is ground hole being played as specially prepared putting, or otherwise defined as such by the committee. For example, it could be with a temporary green, or it could be that the committee separate a double green. Now, a ball is on the putting green when any part of it touches the putting green. And the margin of the putting green does not extend vertically upwards, which means that a ball on the fringe that merely overhangs the green but doesn't touch the surface of the green is not on the putting green. So the main significance of that is that a player in that case cannot clean his balls. Referee, one appointed by the committee to decide questions of fact. For example, did the ball move? Is there virtual certainty the ball is a water hazard? And to apply the rule. He must act on any breach of a rule that he observes or is reported to him. So, and that is how you get into, in part, why we don't want to spend time this morning talking about why, PGA Tour, when someone calls in and says, I think, Nicholson grounded his club in the bunker back there, they're obligated to look into that and see if he that did in fact happen. And just as like an observer or referee should not attend the flag stick, so forth, do things that would put him in a position where to incur a penalty. Yeah.
As an example, and picks up virtually everything, but let's say he didn't see it, and Nicholson says, no, I didn't ground my club. His opponent says, yes, he did. And I know that's happened a number of times over the years. What normally would be the decision?
Yeah, it can be a difficult situation. There's a somewhat new decision back under 13-3 that offers some guidance in terms of determining questions of fact and ruling on the weight of evidence in such situations. Because there are cases where, let's say your case, where it's just a black and white case of he says, she said. One person says, no, I didn't do this. The other person said, yes, you did. That usually in a case like that, where it's truly a coin toss as to what happened, usually you get the benefit to the player involved. In that case, Nicholson, if he was playing the shot. But first and foremost, what a committee should do in situations like that is try to gather all evidence they can. So if it was being televised, see if TV happened to catch it, talk to the players, talk to if they're caddies, if they're volunteers, walking score, if there are any spectators or marshals who saw that, try to gather all the information you can to see if all of that really indicates that yes, he did or no, he didn't. And if it's still 50-50, often you'll give the benefit of the doubt to the player. But it can certainly be a tough situation. All right, now the exception for match play, which is kind of interesting for the referee. Unless the referee is assigned to accompany the players, he has no authority to intervene in the match other than in relation to Rule 1-3, which is the agreement to waive rules, 6-7, undue delay, or 33-7. So, in other words, let's say match play tournament, you've been assigned to watch holes 4, 5, and 6. And you see a player remove a pine cone from a bunker before he plays one. Ordinarily, your reaction is you've got to go up there and warn him that he has a penalty, as you would do in stroke play. But in match play, you wouldn't do that unless you're actually assigned to that match. So you accompany that match through the entire round. You have to bite your lip in that situation, which doesn't seem right, but it's something that you have to force yourself to do. That in match play, if you're not assigned, you're not assigned to a specific match. You're largely there just to answer questions that they bring to you. Rationale for that is I think it's just going back to the principle in a match, it's really between those two players. When you have a referee, though, accompanying that match, he almost becomes part of that match. And I think there's some concern whether how consistently that could be applied throughout the rounds.
That exception was
well, it was interesting that it was added to the definition itself, but that had been part of a U.S. decision for many years. And it is curious because it's so different from what we try to do when fishing. And also what is it means if you see a player about to breach a rule, you have to throw in your hands and let him do it. So, for example, if you see a player dropping 4 club lengths from a lateral water hazard, in stroke play, you go out there and stop him before he plays it, and under 20-6, let him drop in the correct place. So now you should just sit there and just sit there and watch him play from the wrong place, which just seems so contrary to everything else we try to do.
There's no penalty for playing from the wrong place.
Or if his opponent doesn't catch it well. Well, yeah. Well, There's no penalty applied. Great, Dan. This is the type of conversation you and I can have, but it annoys me when somebody says, well, it's only illegal if you're caught. No, it's still illegal. It's just a question of whether there's going to be any consequence for it. All right, rub of the green occurs when a ball in motion is accidentally deflected or stopped by an outside agency. So it could be a good break, it could be a bad break. It is not synonymous with bad luck. So if you hit a good tee shot down the middle, it comes rest in a deep divot hole, that's not a rub of the green, that's just bad luck. Rule or rules. This term applies to, captures all of this. The rules of golf, the decisions on the rules of golf, any conditions of competition, any local rules, and all the specifications on equipment. So part of the significance of this is we'll see under Rule 6-1 that the player is responsible for the rules. So that means he is responsible for knowing all of this, even though we know realistically he does not. But he is responsible for knowing it.
John, can I ask a question about that? Do you think that there is any field, do you think that there is precise amount or weight of the decision here depending on the decision? Differently, if the rule and the decision are in direct contradiction.
I thought we discussed this separately, Dan. I think in one of our exchanges I made a comment that, well, I'm trying to leave this since the rule itself says that. And you said, well, yeah, but a decision says this, and aren't the two treated the same? And as far as applying the rules and what the player is responsible for, they're all treated the same. They all fall under this umbrella. And so you're saying if one contradicts the other, how do you know which overrides the other? The answer is that on our own, we don't. That there are a number of decisions that will kind of break that deadlock and say in this situation this rule overrides that rule and so forth. But without the benefit of such a decision, we really don't know. All right, side is a player or two or more players who are partners. One somewhat interesting point in this, not that there's that much consequence to it, but still interesting to note that caddies are not part of the player's side. That the side is only of players. Stance. Taking a stance consists in the player placing his feet in position for and preparatory to making a stroke. So we'll see this in Rule 13-2, which protects the area of intended stance. We'll see it in Rule 13-3 with building a stance. We'll see it in Rules 24 and 25 with taking relief from the stance in certain conditions. Stipulated round consists of playing the holes in their correct sequence unless otherwise authorized by the committee, as the committee might do, say, when it starts the players off first and 10 or the shotgun start. Number of holes is 18 unless a smaller number is authorized by the committee. So that means, for example, that a 36-hole match consists of 2 stipulated rounds of 18 holes. And part of the significance of that is that between those rounds, the player can get advice, he can change clubs, he can practice and things that he otherwise could not do during a stipulated round. The one exception is that in match play only, if the committee wants a ball square after 18, after its final hole, to be decided by going extra holes. Those extra holes are still part of the original stipulated round. So that means, in a match play tournament between 18 and 19, the player may not change putters. Whereas in stroke play playoff, even on a whole basis, is a new stipulated round. So the player can practice, he can change clubs and so forth.
If we're having a match and want to decide a winner, so you're extending the match, the amount necessary to have the match reach a conclusion. If the match started on 1, obviously I would want number one to be 19th hole. Is there anything that authorizes it to be a hole other than one?
Well, yeah, and that's entirely up to the committee when it lays down the conditions of competition to say, okay, if a match is all square, it shall continue on a hole-by-hole basis on such and such a hole. In fact, what's interesting is during, say, some televised events, that extra hole may well change from one round to the other. For first round, they might say, yeah, going down number one, but then for television purposes, they may say, no, we want you to go back to 16 or something like that. Stroke is the forward movement of the club with the intention of fairly striking at and moving the ball. But if the player checks his downswing voluntarily before the club head reaches the ball, he's not considered to have made a stroke. So several key points here. The forward movement of the club, or what we would consider the downswing. So the backswing is not part of the stroke. It's made with the intention of striking at and moving the ball. So if a player accidentally strikes his ball with a practice swing, he's not considered to have made a stroke, as he wasn't intending to strike it, but he has moved the ball, and whether there's a penalty depends as to whether the ball was in play at that time. If he checks his downswing voluntarily, as sometimes you see Tiger do, he's not made a stroke. But if his downswing is checked involuntarily, for example, Tree Branch stops his club, then he is considered to have made a stroke. A substitute ball is a ball put into play for the original ball that is either in play, lost, out of bounds, or lifted. So sometimes the player is allowed to substitute balls, and sometimes he's not. We'll get into all of that. The team ground is the starting place for the hole to be played. The rectangular area 2 club lengths measured from the outer limits of the 2 tee markers, so really the front outside corners. The ball is outside the team ground when all of it is outside the team ground. So from a player's perspective, there's really only one team ground per hole. That if you start from the blue markers, that's his team ground, and that means that the area, say, defined by the white tee markers or the black tee markers, that's not the team ground, that's just to our next definition, through the green, the whole area of the course, anything within the boundaries except the team ground and putting green as the hole being played, and all hazards on the course. So if I am playing the 6th hole, I hit a wild tee shot onto the 8th hole right between the blue tee markers. Am I through the green? And it says yes, I am. But if I hit my tee shot into a bunker on number 12, in a bunker, or on number 12. Water hazard. Similar to what we saw earlier with lateral water hazard, it's just not a special type. It's in a sea, lake, pond, river, ditch, so forth. And all the water within the margin is part of the hazard. So when it's defined by stakes, the stakes are inside the hazard, the margin is defined by the nearest outside point, part of the stake away from the hazard at ground level. When stakes and lines are used, then the stakes merely identify the hazard, and the line actually defines the hazard margin. The margin extends vertically upwards and downwards, falls in a hazard when it lies in or touches it. The stakes are obstructions, must always be movable. Note 1, the stakes or lines must be yellow. And one reason you see with lateral water hazard, or as we specify the color, is by doing so that actually saves space on scorecards. Say 15 years ago, the rules were silent on the colors, or it recommended they be yellow and red. So as a result, every course, if they wanted to do things correctly, need to put on their scorecard lateral water hazard defined by red stakes. Now they don't have to do that because the definitions do that. You can certainly have an environmentally sensitive area from which play is prohibited that meets the definition of a water hazard, such as a wetland. Wrong ball is any ball other than the player's ball and play, provisional ball, or in stroke play, a second ball played under 3-3, which is down as procedure rule, or Rule 20-7C. You think you may have committed a serious breach of playing from the wrong place. So wrong ball includes other player's ball, an abandoned ball, and the player's original ball when it's no longer in play. So that, I touched on that earlier, definition of wrong play. So that could come up when the player's ball lies out of bounds, or it has become lost, or say when he's lifted it and set it aside without the intention of putting it back into play. If it's not in play, even though it is his ball, it even has his name on it, if he plays it, he will play the wrong ball. Note, ball in play includes a ball substituted, regardless of whether that substitution is permitted. And if it's not permitted, then there's another rule that will cover the improper substitution. It's not a because an improperly, and that's important to note, is because an improperly substituted ball and a wrong ball are treated quite differently under the rules, as we'll see in Rule 15. All right, wrong putting green. Any putting green other than that of the hole being played, unless otherwise prescribed by the committee, the term includes a practice putting green or pitching green on the course. And this definition is in here, as we'll see under Rule 25-3, that a player is prohibited from playing from the wrong putting green, to avoid damaging the wrong putting green. And lines of what it is. So if on hole 8, I spray it onto the 11th green or a practice putting green, I am, as we'll see on Rule 25, I am required to drop the ball off it, not play from that. So any questions on the definitions there? All right, if not, why don't we take a 10-minute break here, and we'll call it 12 minutes. We'll start that. Our attention. Thank you. All right, so the fact that we spent 2.5 hours on just the definitions, among other things, should emphasize the importance of definitions, and not just the number of definitions. That there is a lot of very significant material contained there. And now we'll jump into the rules. And as I said, we'll go through the rules in order. So among other things, that should help you get an idea as to, sessions you might be particularly interested in. For example, if you especially want Rule 20, that after a few more sessions, we'll have an idea of when we'll cover Rule 20 and so forth. So with Rule 1, first, Rule 1-1 defines the game of golf, which consists of playing a ball from the team ground into the hole by a stroke or successive strokes in accordance with the rules. So there are a number of principles and concepts contained just in that. For example, playing a ball. So you're not allowed to play as many balls as you want. Just play a ball with a club. So you only use one club per stroke. From the team ground into the hole by a stroke or strokes in accordance with the rules. And that's what the next 34 rules will all talk about. So several key elements introduced right there. All right, Rule 1-2 is a fundamental rule that those of you who've been involved with the rules for a while will realize that this was significantly changed for the year 2012, but the changes, more than anything, just made the rule mirror what had been the application of the rule over the years. And I think, as Dan would agree, it's never a good thing when the application and the text of the rule don't coincide. And now they do, and I think Dan proves better. Or at least now it does this version. Thank you. All right. 1-2. A player must not, 1, take an action with the intent, underline the word intent, to influence the movement of a ball in play, or 2, alter physical conditions with the intent of affecting the play of a hole. So there are two different elements here. One common thread is both involve the player's intent. And as we'll go through the rules, There are several rules that do, in fact, involve the player's intent to do something. This is one of them. So, for example, there's a big difference between my intentionally deflecting Dan's ball to go out of bounds and Dan's ball and my accidentally deflecting Dan's ball to go out of bounds. And there are different results. And there are other rules where intent's a factor, such as testing the surface of the green. If you rub your ball on the green, are you doing so to learn something about the green, or are you just doing it to get the mud off the ball? But then there are many rules where the player's intent is not a factor. For example, a player, doesn't intend to hit a ball out of bounds. He doesn't intend to play a wrong ball. But if he does, there are consequences for it. So let's look at the first one. If a player takes an action with the intent to influence the movement of a ball in play. So it could be his ball or it could be another ball. It could be for a good reason, it could be for a bad reason. But if he intentionally takes an action to influence the movement of the ball in play, he's in breach of this rule. Or if he alters physical conditions with the intent of affecting the play of a whole. Now that one is a little harder to understand, so let's go through an example. If you look at decision 1-2/3, a player likes to take relief from an area of ground under repair. He determines his nearest relief in the one club length drop area. But he notices there's a small bush located outside the dropping area. And he's concerned that his ball, after landing within the one club length, could roll less than 2 club lengths to come to rest under the bush. And he doesn't want that to happen. So he goes and, let's say, removes the bush. What is the ruling? Well, the first question is, does Rule 13-2 apply? That's the rule that prohibits improving the area in which you're to drop a ball. The answer to that is no, because he didn't improve that one club length area in which the ball must first strike a part of the course. But he did alter the physical conditions of the course for the purpose of affecting the play of the whole, whether his ball would roll to that. And for that reason, he is in breach of Rule 1-2. Now, with that in mind, does it matter if the ball ever rolls to that area? For example, if the ball lands within the one club length and rolls 1 inch, does he avoid a penalty under Rule 1-2? And the answer is no. That as soon as he breaks that bush for that purpose, he's in breach of the rule and cannot escape penalty. Right. A couple of exceptions, and that last example we went through ties into that and ties into a good way to approach such questions. First exception, action that is expressly permitted or expressly prohibited by another rule is subject to that rule and not Rule 1-2. So, for example, if that bush had been inside the one club length area in which he used to drop a ball and he'd broken the bush off, then Rule 13-2 would apply, and we wouldn't look to Rule 1-2. And that can't, because, for example, Rule 13-2 is not an intent-based rule. Similarly, you could have a situation where Rule 23-1 prohibits a player from removing a loose impediment while another ball is in motion, and there's a reasonable possibility that the removal of a loose impediment might affect the ball in motion. And that is not intent-based. So if you remove that loose impediment, even if you weren't doing so for the purpose of influencing the ball in motion, then you could be in breach of Rule 23. So there can be different standards in those other rules. So if there is a rule specifically governs, and that rule will not Rule 1-2 govern. So to some degree, Rule 1-2 is a last resort in such situations. The second exception is an action that is taken for the sole purpose, caring for the course, is not a breach of this rule. There's a decision, 1-2-0.7, that clarifies what is meant by sole purpose of caring for the course. And as it says, That phrase refers to the performance of acts that are encouraged in the etiquette section of the rules book, provided they're taken at the appropriate time and in a manner permitted by the rules. And one example is that, it goes on to say, is smoothing the ragged edge of the hole or tapping down spike marks. So you may not say, and let's assume that there are spike marks, but you may not tap down spike marks for the specific purpose of helping someone else in your group who's not yet finished play. But then after your group pulls out, you may tap down spike marks near the hole, even if it's for the specific purpose of helping someone in the following group. You know, there could be a ball from the following group on or near the green. But in that case, for etiquette purposes, they drew the line is with players in your group. So that's a useful decision to clarify that exception. All right, now the penalty statement, which is somewhat involved. Penalty for use of this rule, match play is lost balls. So straightforward. So if Dan plays and I intentionally deflect his ball, I lose the hole. In stroke play, 2 penalty strokes, and then we'll see in stroke play get into where the player will actually make the next stroke from. But in both match play and stroke play, although we do have a decision 1-2/0.5 that says it should be very, very rare in match play, there is the potential of what's called a serious breach of this rule, in which case the committee may disqualify the player. Note 1 clarifies what's meant by serious breach, and that is if the action taken has allowed him or another player to gain a significant advantage, or has placed another player other than his partner at a significant disadvantage. So if that's the case, then the player would be disqualified. And one point to note with this is that there is no correction mechanism under this rule. There are several rules, for example, under 20-7C, which also uses the term serious breach. If a player commits a serious breach of playing from the wrong place in stroke play, he must correct that mistake or be disqualified. In this case, there is no mechanism for correcting the mistake. So if a player commits a serious breach of Rule 1-2, as soon as he does it, he is disqualified, and there is no way he can prevent that. He can avoid that and rectify the mistake even with a penalty. All right, now second note. In the stroke play, except when a serious breach is involved, a player breaches this rule in relation to his own ball. So, for example, if I intentionally stop my ball in motion, must play the ball from where it was stopped, or if the ball was deflected from where it came to rest. Now, if the movement of a player's ball has been intentionally influenced by a fellow competitor or other outside agency, then Rule 1-4, equity applies to the player. And then the note to Rule 19-1 will tell us what to do, where often you estimate where the ball would have gone if this intentional deflection had not occurred. So that's this note 2 is a good example of enough to take some information that had previously been tucked away into a decision and put it in the rule itself, because the rules are much more accessible, more widely read than the decisions, and therefore more information in the rules, the better. So previously, the rules didn't tell you what to do if a breach of Rule 1-2 occurred in terms of where you actually would play the next stroke from. So, and we'll go through some decisions under that after we finish Rule 1. Rule 1-3, agreement to waive the rules. Players must not agree to exclude the operation of any rule or to waive any penalty incurred, and the penalty in both forms of play is disqualification. So there are several key points here. First is that in order for players to agree to waive the rules, they have to know the rules that they're waiving. In other words, there's a difference between doing something out of ignorance of the rules and intentionally not playing by the rules. So, for example, if Bill and I are playing and I hit my ball on a cart path, neither one of us knows anything about the rules. I say, Bill, it doesn't seem right for me to have to play from here. And he says, yeah, you're right. I don't know what to do. Maybe just toss it out here in the fairway, something like that. I say, okay, that seems fair. So we do that. You know, and I play from there. I breach rule. I haven't seen it properly in Rule 24, and in first play, I'd be subject to penalty for that. But have Bill and I agreed to waive the rules? No. That we're just simply ignorant of the rules. Now, that's very different from the case where, say, now Bill and I are playing, we both know the rules well, I hit my ball onto the cart path. I say, geez, Bill, my nearest point of release would be over here in the bush. That doesn't quite seem, that's a pretty bad deal. He says, John, you're right. I know you're supposed to go in the bush, but I tell you what, why don't you just drop it on the other side of the path? So there, and I say, thanks, Bill, you're the best. So there's a case where he and I know I'm supposed to go to the bush, but he and I have agreed not to do that. Then we would be subject to disqualification. So that's the first point, is there's a difference between doing something out of ignorance and intentionally not playing by the rules. Second point is what triggers a breach of this rule. And that is, and we'll go through an example. Let's say Bill and I are playing a very tight course through a housing development out of bounds on each side of the hole, each side of each hole. And walking out the first fairway, I say, Bill, I'm claustrophobic here. How about if, let's just treat out of bounds like a lateral water hazard. If we get one out of bounds, we can just drop it within 2 club lengths of where it went out of bounds. And Bill says, yeah, I know we're not supposed to do that. You're right, this is absurdly tight. Let's just play that way. And then we play, and as a result, we, without that out of bounds only looming over our heads, we drive the ball very well. We don't hit a single shot out of bounds. Are we breaching Rule 1-3? The answer to that's yes, because what it causes the breach is the agreement. As soon as Bill and I agreed on the first fairway to treat out of bounds like a lateral water hazard, we were disqualified, regardless of whether we actually ever implemented that agreement. And that makes sense, because you could say if there is an effect of that, a benefit, that he and I know how we're going to cheat, basically, then that affects our strategy, how we swing, and so forth.
An agreement to play ready golf. Here's a qualification.
Well, agreement to play ready golf and stroke play is not an agreement that is not subject to disqualification. In match play, there can be some issues with that. I mean, there's some exceptions in match play, but in general, stroke play, that's okay.
If you have some agreement as you walk first.
Oh, okay.
Second.
Yeah, Jim, that's a good question. Let's say that you and I are going to the first tee, and I say, Jim, this is absurdly tight. Let's treat out of bounds like a lateral water hazard. You say, yeah, I know we can't do it, but let's do it. Then, as soon as I tee off and pipe one down the middle, I say, no, we both pipe one down the middle. I say, on second thought, now let's just play by. That as soon as we're still disqualified, is if we tee off, if we start the match, start around with that agreement in place, that's the moment of truth. So it's one thing if on the way to the course, say we were to reach that agreement, but then before we get to the first tee, and you say, John, I just don't feel right about that, let's not do that, then we're okay.
John?
Yeah.
Tournament play. Four players. 3 matches. Each player is playing 3 matches. They agree on the first 2.
Wait, say that again, Ken. You have 4 players?
4 of each player playing one of the. Each player is playing a match with somebody.
Well, I'm afraid the rules don't contemplate that, Ken.
Pardon?
The rules don't contemplate that on the play. I've got jokes. At the USGA, that's how we get out of answering awkward questions. Saying, sorry, rules don't cover that, so I can't give you an answer. But no, I'm sorry, what was your question?
They agree on the first team that any concession has to be unanimous. In other words, I'm playing you, and I concede your putt. So that means that I've conceded the putt with you, but the other two players haven't conceded the putt.
I think the unanimity would make it all right.
Yeah, well, I think,
The question is, they agree that everybody has to agree before there's any concession. Would that be agreed for them?
Well, I think in that case it comes down to what their knowledge of the rules is. That if they believe they can do that, then that's okay. But if they know that they really shouldn't do that, and that doesn't make sense, for them to be able to do that, then they're agreeing to waive the rules. As Bill said, there's a decision similar. If we say Bill 1-3/1-2/2, that's somewhat related to that. It gets into, were they aware or unaware of what they agreed to was wrong.
And Jim's question was covered in 1-3/0.5.
Yeah, 1-3/0.5. And one thing we'll see in both forms of play later under Rule 34 is that agreement to waive the rules is considered to be such an offensive act that there's no time limit for disqualifying players who have agreed to waive the rules. So whether it's a week after or 10 years later, they could be disqualified. All right, now Rule 1-4, points not covered by rules. If any point in dispute is not covered by the rules, the decision should be made in accordance with equity. So the rule is really intended to cover situations to which the other rules simply don't have an answer. But over the years, some people have been inclined perhaps to over-apply this, and maybe it's crept into the decisions a little bit. Our friend Dan here All right, so in case we were cut off before, Dan's words of wisdom for observation of Rule 1-4, where he called equity the first casualty in the war for understanding the rules of golf and the last refuge of a desperate referee, which certainly we've all been there for with difficult situations and you know the result you want to reach, but it's hard to get there under the rules, so you just use smoke and mirrors of equity and say, well, in equity we're going to say this or that.
Under 1-4.
That's right. So that is Rule 1. Now to go through a few of the decisions. Let's see, several of these we've already touched on. And another, if you look at the pair of decisions 1-3/4 and /5, failure of players to apply known penalty and players unaware of penalty or players unaware of penalty incurred, those two decisions reinforce or emphasize the notion of knowledge for there to be a breach of Rule 1-3. There is an important distinction between that. And keep that in mind also when we look at Rule 2-5 and the potential in match play for a player to disregard a breach of a rule by his opponent without really agreeing to waive the rule with the opponent. There is a fine line, but it's an important line between those two. All right, so some of the equity decisions, and for example, decision 1-4/8 is a useful one where, say, you have a situation where a player might take relief from a cart path, and the cart path is taken into casual water, and the relief from the casual water is taken back in the cart path, and if you just keep going back and forth without ever getting relief from both, and that's something that certainly Rules 24 and 25 didn't really contemplate when they were written. So this decision provides a relief procedure that allows them to take relief from both conditions. Decision 1-4/9, bird's nest interfering with stroke is a good example of the use of equity where the other rules would frankly insist on the player playing and damaging the nest, which doesn't seem right. 1-4/10, a dangerous situation. You won't find anything in the 34 rules as to what to do if, say, an alligator is near your ball and you want to play it. You had that last week, and you have both legs. You knew what to do. So you could say that knowing the rules of golf saved your life. That'd be a good T-shirt. And decision 1-4/11 is useful as it clarifies what is meant in the previous decision of dangerous situation. To ask the question, could poison ivy be considered a dangerous situation and therefore a player be entitled to free relief? And as you can imagine, the mess that would exist if whenever you hit it in the weeds, you can generate poison ivy and drop back out into the mown part of the course is not quite right. So really, decision 1-4/10 contemplates something that, like whether it's bees or an alligator, but something that can chase you down the fairway, whereas the poison ivy will not. Decision 1-4/12 was revised extensively for 2012, has improved quite a bit, and we could spend a whole morning talking about this, and we won't. But the most important thing is to realize that this decision is there, and that when you have situations when a player has perhaps breached several rules or breached the same rule more than once, a good reference for determining what the appropriate penalty would be. It is in the second paragraph in the introduction states there's some rules automatically limit the penalties the player incurs. For example, the 14 club rule limits the penalty strokes to 4 strokes out and so forth. But in situations where the rule itself does not limit, there are some principles to determine what the appropriate penalty would be. And you can see each one is given a title with one or more examples under each to go through that. And again, it's something we won't go into detail here, but it is helpful to know that it's there and to go and I encourage you on your own to go through it and just become comfortable with that and with the final section at the end is helpful. Those 3 bullet points. For example, in the first one, especially helpful, determining whether 2 actual layers of unplayed, the committee should consider among other things the similarity of the acts, how close they are to one another in terms of time and location, and whether there are any intervening. That's all good to know. So with all that in mind, though, let's look at the next 2 decisions, 1-4/13/14. Player tries to breach a rule, player breaches same rule prior to stroke. So let's say, for example, you have an obstinate player. So let's say Dan is in a bunker. He takes a practice swing in the bunker. I'm the referee. I say, Dan, you're not allowed to do that. That's a breach of Rule 13-4. He says, well, I'm going to continue to do that then. Then, in effect, the penalty clock is reset, and he will be penalized again if you do that. Then, similarly, the penalty clock is reset if the player takes a stroke in between breaches. So, for example, if my ball's in a bunker, I remove, and I touch the ground with a practice swing, then I play the ball, I leave it in the bunker, and I touch the ground again with a practice swing, I'm going to be penalized twice for that strokes and stroke play. In match play, it's not that much of an issue as I did the first time I lost the hole. But those are useful decisions that come up more than you might think. Any questions on Rule 1 there? All right, on to Rule 2. First, before I forget, I want to mention one website that's very helpful for those of you who are preparing for PGA USGA exam that are just looking to further your knowledge of the rules, and that is throughthegreen.org, which is a website created by Lou Blakey, who is on the USGA's Rules of Golf Committee for many years and its executive committee, and is just a true genius and wizard of the rules of golf. A lot of very helpful information where no one has put more time and thought into the rules in the world than Lou has, and he's written some very insightful papers, and he has some quizzes on there, and he offers some tips on preparing for the exam and so forth, and very helpful to see. Don't know why I had that other two Rule 2s, but anyway, Rule 2. Golf was originally a match play game, so we'll talk about some of the match play specific rules before we get into stroke play. Match consists of one side playing against another over a stipulated round, played by holes. You use the term so many holes up or all square, so many to play. The side is dormy when hit is as many holes up as there are holes remaining to be played. So sometimes it can be tricky to remember who is dormy if someone is 2 up. If Bill is 2 up over me after 16 holes, is he dormy or am I dormy? And Bill would be dormy. Being dormy is a good thing. That all he has to do is have or win one of the remaining holes, and he wins the match. All right, Rule 2-2 is a pretty interesting rule. The first sentence is straightforward. Holes half, each side holds out the same number of strokes. But the second sentence has an interesting provision. When a player is holed out and his opponent is left with a stroke for the half, if the player subsequently incurs a penalty, the hole is halved. Now, it's easier to go through that with an example, and it only applies to this very specific set of facts. Let's say Bill and I are playing a match against each other, and Bill holds out for a 4. And I lie 3, and I'm putting for a 4. And while my ball is in motion, Bill intentionally deflects it, so it doesn't go in the hole. Now, ordinarily, a breach of Rule 1-2 involves a penalty of multiple match play. But in this particular case, what would be the result of the hole? The hole would be half because Bill was holed out, and I was putting to have the hole. Now, what if Bill would hold out for 4, and I had a 20-foot putt for a 3? And then Bill did this. What would be the ruling? Then he would lose the hole. And likewise, if you all paying attention, if Bill pulled out 4, and I lost 4, I'm playing for 5, if Bill reflects my ball, then what's the rule? Okay. Yeah, Bill already won the hole. It doesn't matter. Yeah, if Bill pulled out 4, I was lying 4. So that is. Doesn't matter what we do after that. And then one thing that's interesting, because if you, in 4-ball play, if you try to apply the same thinking, it gets incredibly complicated. We have an odd little decision, 30-3/3. The second paragraph of Rule 2-2 does not apply in 4-ball match play. So in other words, in 4-ball match play, you just get whatever you get, and you don't worry about that. But it is helpful to keep this in mind. The number of times it can come up is quite limited, but just keep it in the back of your mind as a possibility, especially, say, if you're taking a rules quiz and one player is holed out. Just automatically think about this. Matches 1, 2-3 now. Matches 1 when one side leads by number of holes greater than the number remaining to be played. If there's a tie, first the tie in many forms of play is fun. For example, in team competitions, it could be each side gets half a point. But if in individual competitions like the state amateur, state match play where you need a single winner, then the committee may extend the stipulated round to determine a winner. So the key there is that those extra holes are an extension of the same round. They are not a new stipulated round. Rule 2-4, something unique to match play is concessions. You can concede in match play a match at any time, even before you play. That if I have to play Gary tomorrow, I just don't want to be humiliated by losing to him 7-6. I could concede to him today. That's okay. Player may concede a hole at any time at any time. That's okay. So if I hit 2 tee shots out of bounds, I can just say, Gary, the hole should go on. Or more commonly, a player may concede his opponent's next stroke, provided the ball is at rest, and the opponent is considered to have holed out. All may be removed by either side. That's the more common form of play. And what's interesting with that, especially at tournaments involving younger players, high schoolers and college players who don't play that much match play, is the whole concept of concession somewhat of a new one to them, and they don't quite know when they should do it, how they should do it, and so forth. And if you're refereeing a match, regardless of the level, it's a good idea the first team to ask players to be very clear when they concede a putt or when they concede a stroke or a hole, just so there's no doubt about it. So you're not going to say, well, gee, since he sort of nodded his head to me, I thought that was a concession. You just have to have them be as explicit as possible. Then a concession may not be declined or withdrawn. And so if I concede a hole to Bill, then I realize that just from my own bad accounting that Bill actually lay 6 instead of 3 when I conceded that, then it's cheating.
John, can 2 players play in a match play agree to hole everything out before they start the round?
They agree to hole everything out. Well, I think there is that agreement to waive the rules. I think the problem with that is that they're really handcuffing, they're taking away really their rights under Rule 2-5. So I don't think they can really do that. I mean, they can both just be extremely stingy during the round.
What would you recommend? I know the WSGA has a talk, so to say, with 2 players in whatever championship prior to going off. What are the things that you would go over with those 2 players or 4 players?
Oh, just the match play in general? I'd go over concessions and being very clear and vocal about concessions. order of play, just to say that, stroke play, order of play isn't as important. Match play is, and if they have any questions as to whose turn it is to play next, to ask the referee, or to make sure if there's not a referee to figure it out themselves. You can go over with them if there's not a referee, the whole business about the next rule, making claims, and so forth. And then if there's not a referee, tell them, the role the officials have on the course. Say that they're not going to intervene except in these cases. They're largely mainly answer questions you bring to them, and so forth. So those are the things that are kind of the main differences. And it's always interesting that, for example, at the U.S. Amateur Public Links Championship, for example, often in the first round, you hear a referee saying, "Gosh, both my players said that was the first match they'd ever played in their lives." Here they are, the match play portion of a national championship, and they're saying it's the first match they've ever played. And it's kind of interesting. That's one reason why the USGA, prior to the first round match play, tries to talk to players on the practice screen, before they get to the tee, that they're already going to be a little worked up, and just remind them it's a little bit different, try to put them at ease with what some of the differences are, and so forth.
Now, another philosophical question with regard to refereeing. I know at the Masters, is it John Barrymore, the gentleman from the European Tour?
Paramore.
The idea of when to notify a player of a breach or an infraction, and to comment on when you would or when you wouldn't.
Well, in match play, you want to do it as soon as possible, just because in match play with the head-to-head element, there's the concept that what you do directly affects what I do. So if I know that you just incurred a one-stroke penalty, that could well affect what I do next. So you should have stroke play. Yeah, and stroke play, it can depend on the situation. If you know it's a situation where the players absolutely incurred the penalty, often what you would do, sometimes you might do it during play of the hole, but often between holes. But sometimes it's the type of situation that might involve some discussion to determine if there was a breach at all. Sometimes you wait until he returns the scorecard there. And it's difficult because sometimes you feel like you can't tell players right away, sorry, you just incurred a two-stroke penalty for whatever. Then they'll say, "Oh, geez, you completely ruined my round. I thought about the remainder of the round." But then if you tell the player at the end of the round, "Sorry, you incurred a two-stroke penalty back there on number 11. Well, why didn't you tell me? I played the last 7 holes differently. So I think if anything, probably err on the side of telling them early, especially when you know something. But if it's something where you're not sure if the breach occurred, you don't want to have a 10-minute discussion in the 13th fairway. Some of those are better saved for the scoring area. Okay, Rule 2-5, down is to procedure. And we'll see there's a big difference here between match play and stroke play. So in match play, if something comes up and the players aren't sure what the ruling is, and there's not a referee readily available, they have to continue on. And one player, if he doesn't like the result, can make a claim about that. And if he does so, then the committee then can consider the claim only if the claim is made in a timely manner, and we'll see later what timely manner means, and if the player making the claim is notified his opponent, one, that he's making a claim or wants a ruling, and two, why he's doing that, the facts of the situation. And if a claim is, for a claim to be considered to have been made in a timely manner, then once the player learns of the circumstances, learns of the facts, he must make the claim before either player plays from the next tee, or if it's the last hole, before both players leave that putting green, or when this comes up after they've left the final putting green before the result has been officially announced. So, for example, let's say Bill and I are playing together, and on the third hole, Bill sees me remove a pine cone from a bunker that my ball was in. and that he has to make a claim about that before either one of us tees off on the fourth hole. That if he's feeling good about things, he won the first two holes, and he's feeling good about number 3, but then we wind up having number 3, and then I win 4, 5, and 6. Then he says, "Hey, wait a minute, what about back there at 3? Too late for him to make a claim," since he was aware of the facts at that time. Now, the next paragraph talks about a late claim. A claim relating to a prior hole may only be considered if it's based on facts previously unknown to the player making the claim and he had been given wrong information. So let's say, for example, on the third hole I removed the pine cone from the bunker, but Bill was in a bunker on the other side of the green and didn't see that. Then we play out the third hole. We're tee off number 4, walking down the 4th fairway. And I say, "Bill, very strange. Back there was a pine cone in the bunker, and I don't know why, because there aren't even any trees on this golf course. I don't know where that pine cone could have come from." He said, "Wow, that's weird. So did it cause you to create any problems for the shot?" "Oh, no, I just tossed it out." So at that point, could Bill make a claim about what I did on number 3? The answer is yes, because 1 is based on facts previously unknown, that he did not know before we teed off number 4 that I'd removed the pine cone from the bunker, and 2, I'd given him wrong information. As we'll see in Rule 9, I'd incurred a penalty when I removed that loose impediment from the hazard, and I was obligated to tell him. By not telling him, I gave him wrong information. So since both criteria were met, he can then make a late claim about that.
I have a question here from online, and I think I know the answer because we've discussed this, but can a claim be made on the current hole if a breach has been ignored on prior hole or hole? On a prior hole.
Can a claim be made on the current hole if a...
And I'll give you an example of what, because I had this happen, or got a call about this. You and I are playing a match, and through 14 holes, I'm 3 up. And on the 15th tee, I see that you have 15 clubs. But I'm 3 up, 4 holes left. I'm going to win. I don't say anything. You win 15, 16, and 17. Now we're all there. You both tee off on 18. I hit a crummy drive. You hit an awesome one. Now it looks like I'm going to lose. Oh, by the way, John, you have 15 clubs. Okay, the answer I got, and I think I know why, it was apparently a memorandum or something within the Rules Committee, was that because I ignored it, it was no longer fact previously unknown to me. And so I could not make that claim, and we would play out the 18.
Yeah, and that's right. Because in that case, with the breach of the 14 club rule, that as soon as you became aware of that on 15, that's when you had to say something. That's a little it's very different than a case where, let's say, because it's the same breach in effect, where say you keep doing something wrong. Like let's say I'm in a bunker on every hole, and every time I'm in a bunker, I take practice swings and touch the sand. And you kind of say, well, John's losing every hole, so it doesn't matter. I'm not going to say anything. But then I start winning a few holes, and I still continue to do that. Then all of a sudden, it's now I've 6 times so far, but now I do it again on 16. And on 16, you can make a claim about what I do on 16 when I touch the sand, but you can't put not in colors on the previous holes.
And that would have to do with the timing of the claim.
Yeah, correct.
Okay. Hopefully that answers.
Yeah, so and let's talk about one case where, let's say, going back to the pine cone example, where, Bill, feels bad for me, that he knows he's going to beat me by a lot, and he doesn't want to rub salt in the wound by imposing a loss of hole penalty. So how can he tell me, John, you're not allowed to remove pine cone? If he saw me remove the pine cone from bunker on number 3, how can he tell me, just for my own future edification, not to do that again without there being a penalty? What he could do is he could wait till we tee off number 4. Then we're walking down number 4, he could say, John, just so you know, in the future you're not allowed to remove loose impediments like pine cones from hazards when your ball's in there. Because at that point, one, because it's too late for him to make a claim, he and I are not agreeing to waive the rules because it's too late for him to apply for the penalty to be applied. So that's one way for him, in a nice way, not to call me on the penalty, but also to let me know for future use what I was doing wrong. So, let's see. Then moving on, once the result has been officially announced, a claim may not be considered unless the committee is satisfied that a lot has happened. That one, the claim is based on facts that are previously unknown to the player making the claim. The player making the claim had been given wrong information, and then this is the new element. And three, the opponent knew he was giving wrong information. So in other words, the opponent was basically lying/cheating. So in this case, with the pine cone example, if Bill and I play a match, I remove the pine cone from the bunker on number 3, Bill doesn't see it, we finish the match, and I win the match 1-up. The results posted, and the next day, someone, Dan says to Bill, I'm really sorry to see you lose, especially to somebody who cheats like John. Number 3, as soon as you turn your back, John picked that pine cone out of the bunker. So at that point, could Bill make a claim? And the answer is yes, because one, he didn't know I'd removed the pine cone. 2, I'd given him wrong information. I hadn't told him of the penalty. And then 3, I knew I was giving him wrong information because it sounded like, I waited and did it when he wasn't looking, which with implication, therefore, that I knew I wasn't allowed to do that.
In the example that I gave you about the club, and I was 3 up with 4 to go, and you won 16, 17, and 18. I know I couldn't make a claim of a hole prior to number 18. Could I make the claim about too many clubs for the 18th hole itself?
I would say not, because by that point, to be a penalty, I'd already incurred the maximum penalty. So it's really just a matter, since the penalty hasn't changed, whether it's been imposed on 15 or 18, the penalty is the same. So it really would need to be imposed at that time. And you could argue whether it's different on, and some people go back and forth about what to do if you notice it in the first fairway, but you say something on the second hole. Could there still be a 1-hole deduction for the second hole? Maybe so. So, since that's the case where you're still building the penalty.
So in somebody's asking this, in my example, there would be no penalty and we would simply play out the 18th hole.
Correct.
And hopefully that answers.
Yeah, and I think that's, I think a lot of people think that's the right answer because, you don't want players to be able to kind of inventory things like that. There's things you become aware of the breach. You have to act on that right away. So that's why in this paragraph, starts a claims considered to be made in a timely manner if upon discovery of circumstances giving rise to a claim. So as soon as you learn the facts, even if it's a late claim, you have to make a claim.
That also goes to your philosophy of the sooner you can notify of a breach, the better.
The person has to declare one of the clubs out of play, so he doesn't have all 15 the rest of the hole?
Yeah, and that's a good point. What Bill could do on 18, he could say, Sean, you've got too many clubs. I noticed this back on 15. So what would be the procedure then? And then let's say we call an official over. Then what the official should say is that, well, if you notice back on 15, it's too late to make a claim. But, John, now that you're aware you have too many clubs, you have to declare one of your clubs out of play. So you're right, that there is still that obligation to do that. All right, so now the notes. The first one we mentioned earlier, a player may disregard or breach the rules by his opponent provided there's no agreement to waive the rules. And that, again, can be tricky. It's one thing if Bill on his own sees me move that pine cone from the bunker and then decides to say nothing. That's disregarding the rules. Or breach the rule by me, no problem. But if as soon as I toss the pine cone out, so says, hey, John, what are you doing? You're not allowed to do that. That should be a loss of hole penalty, but I'm not going to call that. And I say, gosh, Bill, thanks. You're the best. then what's happened? He and I have agreed to waive the rules. So we both aware that there's a penalty, and we've made the decision not to apply that penalty, so then we would be disqualified. So there is a fine line, but it's an important line there. Then a reminder with note 2 that in match play, if you're not sure what to do, you may not play 2 balls. So a good way to look at making a claim is that, and there's certainly different facts that can give rise to a claim, but a common one that we often hear about in match play, and we'll go through the examples in stroke play, is let's say Bill and I are playing together and I hit my ball into an area that I think should be ground under repair. Bill disagrees. Then, really, in match play, I have a decision to make. If I strongly believe that the committee would mark that ground under repair, I can go ahead and take relief. And if Bill really disagrees with that, he can make a claim. So I am proceeding knowing that there's a risk in taking relief. That if I'm going to lose the hole, I'm playing from the wrong place. So there is some risk to that.
In the event that would happen in a WSGA championship, which is very unlikely, and likely the referee would not be given the authority to declare ground under repair, and that would be reserved for a rover. Could you comment on whether or not a rover should declare that to be ground under repair?
You can't limit the referee's duties in match play, right?
No. But you're right. Stroke play. But, and let's say you have a situation where maybe it's the first round, there simply aren't enough referees to have a referee with each match. So they just have zone officials. And the 2 players are going back and forth. Could they call the official over and say, hey, look, is this ground repair? Yeah, and then that'd be fine for the official to say yes or no and resolve it then and there. And that's certainly preferred to having a claim made and so forth. Then,
had a question. It said, would the player that cheated be DQ'd, or would the match be adjusted to all square if he had won 1? And I think that goes to and then he writes, the match announces John winning 1 up, but you waive claim based upon all 3 factors in the last paragraph.
Yeah, and that's the case with that last situation where after the results have been announced and those 3 criteria are met, the question is, what then? Do you simply say, John really lost that hole when he should have won it, so you all should go back out to 17 and finish the match? Or, and to my way of thinking, I think you make a pretty strong case that the player, me, should be disqualified. If I knowingly gave wrong information, I think you can make a case for the application of Rule 3-7, disqualification for that, which also helps things dramatically from a practical standpoint. So you okay with that, Dan?
Good call.
All right, 2-6, general penalty. The penalty for breach of rule in match play is loss of hole except when otherwise provided. And this is there just as a catch-all, because there are a few rules where there's not a penalty statement, and occasionally a committee might adopt a local rule and forget to add a penalty statement, and this is just there as a catch-all. All right, so now let's go through the Rule 2 decisions. Some highlights. Decision 2/3, refusal to comply with the rule in match play. As we'll see in Rule 3-4, in stroke play, if a player refuses to comply with the rule that affects the rights of another player, he is disqualified. But the rules themselves don't provide the answer to that situation in match play, but this decision does. And that uses Dan's friend equity to provide for a loss of hole penalty for that. So that's something that occasionally can come up, and it's kind of tucked away here, so it's good to know, 1, that it exists, and 2, where it exists. One point decision that helps that all the match play events, while it seems like purely administrative one that can get people worked up, is decision 2-3/2, the result of match when players dormy and opponent concedes, and it goes through 5 situations where on the last hole there's a handshake and how to interpret that, whether it's a concession of the hole or of the match or what. And the answer, fortunately, is nice and simple. Say the handshake between the players is deemed to represent an agreement to concede each player's next stroke. So therefore, to determine the final result of the hole, and therefore of the overall match, you just add 1 to whatever the players were lying at the time of the handshake, and there you have it.
And that is for sure a test question.
What was that? I got yelled at by Pat.
Championship 2-3/2.
I did it like stroke. I know, or not if you're doing your handicap, what were you likely to get? I did that, and Patsy called me up and he said, what happened here, Doug? Guy was 15 feet off the green, and you had to give him the next stroke because he had won, the guy that the match was lost. And so it's like, well, put him down for a quarter, and I'm supposed to put him down for it.
Yeah, what's confusing with that is it's sometimes you want to almost wonder if you should complicate things and differentiate between including the result of the match to say, okay, Fry went 3-2, versus say, giving accurate hole-by-hole score that, say, to the people watching online at home have a sense as to how that hole actually came out. Because it could be they might see, Fry made 3, Elsner made 4, close hole, good birdie by Doug, when it could be, who knows, it could have been more realistically 5 and 8 or something. And so it doesn't really paint an accurate picture, but it's, at least it's simple.
Because all you got to do is refuse to shake their hand.
So my problem is with the electronic device, I entered it as what the score was likely to be. That's when Patsy called me over, because over at the scoreboard, they get whatever's on your electronic device. So you had to put out into the public domain a score that looks really goofy, even though that's what the rule says. Once that hole is conceded.
So the bottom line is when you're following a match online, don't put too much stock in the scores that you see, just in the result. All right. On to Rule 2-4, the decisions. 2-4/6, commonly asked questions. One is, what's the ruling if a player putts out after a concession? Answer is that there's no penalty unless, say, in a 4-ball match, doing so would assist his partner, in which case the partner, the one who benefits, is disqualified for the hole. The other 2-4 decisions are relatively straightforward. 2-5/2 again reemphasizes the mechanics and the procedure for making a valid claim. To say that you want a ruling and why you're making a ruling. You can't just, I can't just say, Arnold, I'm not sure you're allowed to do that. That's not very clear. And likewise, I can't just say, Arnold, I'm making a ruling over what you did on that hole. And, he may have done a lot of things on that hole. So it needs to be specific.
All of it. All of the above.
And let's see, 2-5/5.5 is a good one because it touches on a little bit an example that Phil used, and it touches on the mechanics for making a late claim. On completing the 14th hole, A wins 5 and 4. They continue their round, just making their way back to the clubhouse, and then they realize that A has 15 clubs in his bag. So before they get into the clubhouse and the result of the match is posted, B reports the facts to the committee and asks for a ruling. Is the claim valid? So is this late claim valid? The answer is yes. Because 1, B did not know how many clubs A had, and 2, A had given him wrong information. He'd incurred a penalty for carrying too many clubs and had not informed B of that penalty. So he's able to do that, and then there's a case where they would go back out and adjust the state of the match. So A thought he was up 5 after 14. Instead, he would be up 3 after 14 after the adjustment. The decision 2-5/6, while a specific example doesn't come up that much, it establishes a more general principle that does come up a lot. In the match between A and B, A is 1 up after 18. However, both A and B believe the match is all square, so they continue on, and B wins after the second extra hole. The error is then discovered. What's the ruling? Well, at this point, neither, since A didn't make a claim for going extra holes, the match stands as played. So often in match play, if the two players out of ignorance agree to do something, whatever they agree to do stands. And the person who comes out on the wrong end of that just has himself to blame.
In our 2-5 match play.
So the match was over and they didn't realize it and they continued?
Yeah, like we was 1-1 up. Ice came through and they're like, oh, we got to go extra hole. He came back. This guy won, and they were sitting around and they figured out that the other guy had been won.
And that's not out of the question.
Would remember.
And that's one reason to say that when you do have a referee assigned to the match, that even though you feel like an idiot when there are no spectators, it's only you and the two players, after each hole, to say Mr. Jones 5, Mr. Smith 4, Mr. Smith goes 2 up. So after each hole, they hear that. They can question it if their minds have done it.
The part about this was each player had a caddy, and one side had like 2 or 3 people following them, and the other side had 3 or 4. It was an entourage, and you couldn't believe it.
Wow.
Well,
let's see. Decision 2-5/8.5. Useful where here the players aren't sure as to whether a player should take relief. The players out of ignorance say, yeah, take relief, and then they realize, whoops, no, actually it's declared to be an integral part of the course, and then he wants to make a claim about that. And the answer is the claim must not be considered by the committee because the opponent and player agreed. The player's entitled to relief, and if this agreement was reached, there's no longer a doubtful or disputed point. And 2-5 is all about doubtful or disputed. So once they reach that agreement, then that's it. And again, keep in mind in this case, they reached that agreement out of ignorance, and they were not agreeing to waive the rules. Those are the ones I had flagged for Rule 2, the decisions. Any questions on Rule 2? What do you think? Should we go through Rule 3? Yeah, we can do that. While we watch the snow fall outside.
No, it's abating.
All right, Rule 3 deals with stroke play. First, where we clarify who the winner of a stroke play or what a stroke play competition is and who the winner is. With obviously one of the benefits of stroke play is you can have many players competing simultaneously against each other, whereas in match play it's just one side against one side at a time. Rule 3-2, failure to hole out. Because there are no concessions in stroke play, and that's out of necessity because you could be playing against 100 other people, and how could you have 100 people agree as to whether a stroke should be conceded? Everyone has to hole out, and if you don't hole out before playing from the next tee, you are disqualified. This is the first of 5 situations we'll cover in stroke play where a player is disqualified unless he corrects a mistake within a certain time frame. All right, Rule 3-3. All right. Well, you're saying there's 6 of them? Oh, we'll see. When I come to the 6th, you can tell me.
11-4 and 11-5. We're counting that as one, right?
Yes, I am. All right, Rule 3-3, which covers what a player should do in stroke play when he is not sure what he's allowed to do or what he's required to do. And before we get into this rule, it helps somewhat to put it in perspective. So far, and this might change, but to date, the rules makers have been very generous to players proceeding under Rule 3-3 because such a player has already admitted that he doesn't know what to do, and we don't want to penalize him further by trying to do the right thing when he already knows he doesn't know what to do. So some results may seem overly generous, but that's the philosophy from which the results do flow. And as I said, that may well change down the road, but that is the current thinking that explains some of the rulings we'll see. In stroke play, if a competitor is doubtful of his rights, he may play 2 balls. And then, this is the procedure he needs to follow. After the doubtful situation has arisen, and before taking further action, the competitor must announce that he intends to play 2 balls and with which ball he wants to score if the rules allow. So, a common example is a player hits his ball into an area he thinks should be ground to repair. So before taking further action, which means before playing the ball or before dropping a ball, he needs to say he's playing 2 balls and with which ball he wants to score. In most cases, but not all, but in most cases he'll say, I want to score with the second ball I drop outside ground to repair. And there could be some cases, and some people will say, well, why does he need to specify the ball with which he wants to score? Isn't it obvious he wants to score with the second ball? The reason he's playing the second ball. Well, not necessarily, because there can be cases where a player might play a second ball merely to protect himself. For example, let's say a player hits a tee shot down the right near a boundary, and he can't tell if that ball is in bounds or out of bounds. So he says, I'm going to play 2 balls. I'm going to play this ball as it lies, and I'm going to play a second ball from the tee, but I want to score with the first ball, in case the committee determines that ball was in bounds. But he's playing that second ball just to protect himself, in case the committee says that ball was out of bounds. So that's why the player needs to specify with which ball he wants to score. And before returning the scorecard, he must report the facts to the committee. If he fails to do so, he's disqualified. So, for example, if a player plays 2 balls and walks off thinking even that he scored 5 and 5 with each ball, so he figures, I don't need to bother the committee. I know my score is 5 for the hole. And he doesn't tell them, he would be disqualified. And part of the reason is that a player played 2 balls has already acknowledged he doesn't know what to do, and there's a pretty good chance that neither score is correct, or at least one, if not both of those scores, is correct. So you might think he scored 5 and 5 when maybe he scored 7 and 7 or something like that. So by requiring him to report to the committee, that just helps ensure that he ultimately returns the correct score for that hole. So it's there to help him. All right, now note, what if the player doesn't follow this procedure? What if he takes further action before dealing with the doubtful situation? Then this rule does not apply to the score the original ball counts. And we'll go through an example, and I'm not sure anyone necessarily is what the exact facts were, but probably the most celebrated case came in the 1958 Masters. On the 12th hole, Arnold Palmer, in the final round, Arnold Palmer is playing with Ken Venturi, and Palmer hits the ball over the green, the ball embeds in some soft ground. And the official on the hole tells him that he does not give relief for an embedded ball. Then this is where the stories diverge. That according to Venturi, Palmer then played out the hole, made a 5, double bogey, and then while walking to the next tee said, I just know I get relief. Then he went back and played a second ball. So if that is what happened. Under today's rule, what would be the result? He gets the 5. Even if the committee says, yeah, you're right, you're entitled to relief. He took further action. He played the ball before he announced he played 2 balls. Whereas, the other version of the facts is that Palmer disagreed with the ruling and right away said, I'm going to play 2 balls. And played both balls in, scored 5 with the first ball, scored 3 taking relief. They indicated he wanted, obviously, relief with to score with the second ball, and then a few holes later, Bob Jones told him the score for the hole was 3, and he went on to win his first Masters. But but that's a case where the sequence of events is very important with Rule 3-3.
I have a question, John. Yeah. If you do 3-3, this happened to me this week. The guy declared he was going to play 2 balls, and he wanted this ball to count. But then he was just off the green, so he chipped it up there, and he putted it out where he played the second ball.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I think Ed's question is the player's just off the green, and he says, for some reason, I want to play 2 balls. So he makes that announcement, and then he chips the first ball up, taps in, and then he might use that same ball, come back and drop it or do whatever he was going to do with the second one. Is that okay? And the answer is yes. There's one thing that's interesting with this rule. This rule does not impose any required sequence of events the player must take in order to get it right. To say, you must play the original ball first, or you must do this or that. So as long as he indicated before he did anything he was going to play 2 balls, and the mechanics of that were, while a little unusual.
You had gone through a scenario last year about having mud on your ball, declaring Rule 3-3, and somehow not playing the original ball with the mud on it. I was wondering if you remember that.
There can be a case where sometimes you can be suspicious of some players trying to use 3-3 just perhaps to get a clean ball or something like that. Because normally when you think about playing 2 balls, you think about playing the original as it lies and dropping and playing the second ball. But we have a decision that talks about, well, what if you lift and drop the original and then put a second ball back on the original location, in which case you have 2 balls when you do that. And that seems odd, but strictly speaking, that's okay. And I guess you'd say that if you're really convinced the player is doing that just to get the mud off the ball, then maybe there's Rule 33-7 or something like that. But does that answer your question? In some cases, especially when you get closer to the hole, you can imagine some players who where was it? PGA one. Who might not have a second ball. Their batting might be over there. They might have a second ball on them. And, can you actually play 2 balls using physically the same balls? The answer is yeah.
So basically, once you announce your intent to play 2 balls and determine and announce which ball you want to score, there's no sequence requirement at that point.
Correct.
Yeah. You may want to do it.
Yeah.
If you're by the green,
we're
first so you can feel it.
Or to help with club selection.
That's why I assumed no, I said it was okay. And I was guessing.
Ed's question is a good one. It goes back to the underlying principle of bending over backwards to accommodate players under this rule. That if you do impose a sequence that players must follow, then they get
I was basically on a sequence. Because I know you can play in any order. I was thinking that's fine.
Yeah, and I can certainly understand that seems odd, and I can definitely understand that. All right, now the players play 2 balls. Now, so it's determined as the committee what his score for the hole is. If the ball a competitor selected in advance has been played in accordance with the rules, then that's his score. So let's go back to the simple possible ground repair situation. If the player's ball's in a bare area, since I'm going to play 2 balls, I want to score the second ball, I drop outside it. So he plays the first ball as it lies, and the second ball he drops and plays within an area that would conform to the ground under repair rule, if that is in fact ground under repair. And the committee says, yes, that is ground under repair, then he scores with the second ball. That's the reason he played the second ball.
Even if that scores higher.
Yeah, even if that scores higher. Even if he gets 4 and 6, it's the 6. So otherwise, the score of the other ball counts if the rules allow the procedure adopted for that ball. So what would otherwise include in this case? Could mean that the ball selected in advance was not played in accordance with the rules. So, for example, if the committee says, no, that's not ground under repair, then he would score with that original ball, because that original ball was played in accordance with the rules. Now, second point where he doesn't announce. He fails to announce in advance the decision or the selection. The score with the original ball counts, provided it has been played in accordance with the rules. If the original is not one being played, the first ball put in play counts, provided it was played in accordance with the rules. Otherwise, the score with the other ball counts if the rules allow the procedure adopted for that ball. So, let's say, let's first take common situation, then we'll take an uncommon situation. With the bare area ground under repair, if I just say, Bill, I'm going to play 2 balls here. I play the original ball as it lies, and I drop and play a second ball under the ground under repair rule. In the committee, I go and report to the committee. And even if the committee says, yes, that is ground under repair, how would they rule in that case? The original ball played from the bare area would count. So, now let's take a somewhat of a far-fetched situation, but I use it just so we won't fall into the trap of saying you always score with the original or the first ball in such a case. Now let's say I hit my ball into a decorative flower bed, and I don't know if I'm allowed to play from it. So I say, Dan, I don't know if I'm allowed to play with it. I'm going to play 2 balls to be safe. And that's all I say. So I play the first ball from the flower bed, and then I drop and play second ball outside it in a spot that would satisfy the ground under repair rule. I report to the committee, and the committee says the decorative flower beds are ground under repair with mandatory relief. Okay, so I've announced I'm going to play 2 balls, but I didn't announce my selection. So first, look to say, okay, was the original ball played in accordance with the rules? In this case, was it? No, it was not. Okay, was the second ball played in accordance with the rules? Yes. So this is a case where I would score with the second ball, even though I didn't specify I wanted to score with that ball. So in effect, what the rules are saying, if you play 1 ball correctly and 1 ball incorrectly, you'll score with the correct ball. You know, again, a way to help the player out, even though I didn't do what was right. And again, I mentioned that just as an example of a case where you could score with the second ball even if you didn't say you wanted to score with that ball. Yes?
You don't know if it's ground under repair. You choose to play the ball, the second ball, and you drop the ball nearer the hole than the nearest player is. And the committee comes out and says, yes, you were entitled to relief. You played the second ball not according to the rules. Does the original ball count?
Okay, all right. Question. Let's say, back to the basic ground under repair question, where I say I want to play 2 balls and I want to score at the ball, I'm going to drop outside it under the ground under repair rule, except where I drop and play from does not satisfy the ground under repair rule. It would be a wrong place under that rule. Then, even if the committee says that is ground under repair, I would score with the original ball played from the ground under repair because ultimately the rules didn't allow me to do what I did, to drop and play from where I played from. So that's a good question.
As a adjunct to that, it's the flower bed where you must drop out of. You dropped incorrectly. You played it out. You played from the wrong place. Both are being played incorrectly. Right? Okay. play, which one would count? The one with the wrong place?
Well, that's a very good question. The next thing I was going to add is what's interesting is the rule 3-3 doesn't answer the question, what do you do if neither ball is played in accordance with the rules? But fortunately, we have this decision 3-3/0.5, which really is one of the more helpful decisions in the book because it slowly walks you through the process of the rule, and also it provides some answers that the rule itself doesn't provide, such as what you do if neither ball is played in accordance with rules. And then you'll see, I think it's in I-3 there, it spells that out. You know, it gets into whether there's a serious breach of one and not the other, and so forth. So the notes to 3-3, if the player plays the second ball, strokes made after this rule has been invoked with ball rule not to count, penalty strokes incurred by playing that ball are disregarded. The second ball played under this rule is not a provisional ball, but in some cases you could have a provisional ball serve as a second ball under this rule. For example, the case where I hit my tee shot near a boundary line, I also played a provisional, and I get up there and I can't tell if I'm in or out. I can say I'm going to play two balls, but that second ball being my continuation of my provisional ball. Look at a couple of decisions there. 3-4 we touched on earlier. A competitor refuses to comply with the rule affecting the rights of another player, he is disqualified. And fortunately, there are few examples where this could occur. Probably the most cited example is that of failing to lift a ball under Rule 22. General penalty in stroke play is 2 strokes. Now let's take a look at the decision. 3-3/0.5 is a good one to spend some time on. 3-3/6, somewhat like one version of the Arnold Palmer situation, emphasizing what happens if a player takes further action and then invokes Rule 3-3. We say, well, no matter what, he's going to score with the original ball. But that final paragraph, the final sentence, is useful because it provides that there's no penalty for having played the second ball. So even though Rule 3-3 did not apply to such a situation, we're not going to say that the player was practicing or playing a one ball or substituting balls or anything like that. Just say that you're not going to score at that second ball, but there's no penalty for having played it.
John, question for you. That rule by hitting two balls, and trying to get a practice swing in, or running with it.
Yeah, what's interesting and unfortunate, a very fortunate thing is that when you look at the rules, you think, gee, if somebody's really shady, he could do this or that. And you think, gee, why doesn't this happen? But then in practice, very few things like that happen. I can't remember a case like that. And, there's the expression that the rules are written on the presumption that players are honest, that the rules are not written to take into account to prevent, sneaky players from something. But fortunately, that has not happened. And in fact, that Bill's not aware of a situation that, given how many tens and tens of thousands of rounds of golf he's overseen, I think says a lot.
I have a question which should have come up in Rule 2, but it just popped into my head. There's no penalty for practice for playing a stroke after a conceded stroke, a hole after a conceded hole. You and I were scheduled to play a match, and I, out of fear of your prowess on the golf course, conceded the match to you. Could you go out and play the match if we had a local rule that prohibited practice on the course of the other competition? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So you're saying that it's a condition of competition that players are allowed to practice on the course before or between matches.
It's a big seminar, we'd say, Bill. That's one of those what-ifs. Not allowed to ask that question.
If I go ahead and play the round, would that be practice Geez, I don't know. But it's like one way to look at it is if we start our match, let's say on the first hole, or whether it's on the 16th hole or the first hole, you concede the match. No problem finishing the round. So if I'm entitled to finish the round, I don't know. I wouldn't think so. You don't think so? What?
I think you'd be allowed to finish.
It's never going to happen. It popped into my head when you brought up about that.
Well, here's one scenario that it could happen. You're playing in the WSGA championship on one of the days where you play 3 matches. And on the first one, somebody gets sick, so they forfeit. Can you go and play your round while you're waiting for the next?
At USGA championships, you could, but the USGA doesn't prohibit practice on the course. But if USGA did, I think Jim's right that it's hard to say that you're doing anything other than practicing.
Right. You never began the round, so all you really could do. Right.
Yeah, that's the. I don't like that distinction between the.
That's probably the most where you just put it. You can't continue something that you never started. So that's probably the best way to put it. We should probably go back and roll 3.
All right. Let's see. Decision 3-3/6.5 is a good one to be aware of because the answer is not necessarily what you think it might be. And it has this where a player, without announcing his decision to invoke Rule 3-3 or the ball with which he'd score, he drops and plays the second ball. He then plays the original, completes blah, blah, blah. He returns the scorecard to the committee and does not report the facts to the committee. What's the ruling? And this first sentence is important. Although the competitor did not announce his decision to invoke the rule, it is clear from the facts that he intended to invoke such rule, which means, therefore, he's under the umbrella of Rule 3-3, and therefore the requirement to report to the committee is still there. So what this means is even if the player does nothing in terms of announcing the desired intention to play a second ball or the ball with which he wants to score, he can still be under Rule 3-3. And that's a pretty important point that's kind of hidden in there. And then that's it for the Rule 3 decision. If any questions on Rule 3, again, that decision, Rule 3 is mainly about 3-3, and that decision 3-30.5 is very, very well, very helpful. All right, let's see. Next week we're meeting next Friday, not Thursday, but on Friday from 8 to 12 again. So we'll pick up with Rule 4, and we'll be the same. Bill and Dave will send out instructions for sign up for online or in person, and as well as a link to the YouTube recording of this morning's discussion. Oh, and the February schedule will be sent out as well. So thank you all for coming, and thanks for...
Thank you, Jim.
Thursday. Thank you, John.